Faith and Fireworks, a sweet and inspirational cowboy romance. Written by Josie Rivera. Narrated by Josie Rivera. Chapter 1. The fence post split clean under the third strike of the maul, and Levi Holt set the tool against the rail to catch his breath. He rolled one shoulder, easing the ache that had taken up residence there before breakfast. A pale line of sun carved across the back of his neck. Sweat had soaked through his chambray shirt an hour ago. Above him, the sky ran a flat, hard blue. Late May in the Bitterroot Valley, when the cold finally let go and a person could work outside past noon without his hands going stiff. Levi breathed in the sharp green air, so clean it almost hurt. He used to thank God for mornings like this without thinking on it twice. Lately, the thanks got as far as his throat and stalled there. Fresh cedar shavings from the post mixed with the cool, wet field. Sparrow Creek Ranch smelled exactly like it had before life divided itself into before and after. By the draw, an irrigation pump ticked, the valley's version of a heartbeat. Down the rail, Dale Hutchins set another post, 30 years of working this ground, every day of it under Levi's Uncle Cal, long before Levi's name was ever on the deed. Past him, a dozen cows grazed the pasture with their calves close, the rest of the herd scattered toward the trees. One calf bumped awkwardly against its mother before finding breakfast. Another 5 months before the calves were sold, and the year either worked or it didn't. A year and a half back on this soil, and most days the work did its job. Fence lines, feed schedules, a ranch that didn't care what a man had brought back across an ocean. Uncle Cal used to say a body in motion had less room for ghosts. Levi had taken that as gospel. He'd worked hard enough to wear out 3 pairs of gloves, and the ghosts still kept pace. Tires crunched on the gravel, and a white Chamber of Commerce truck rolled up the drive, grit lifting in a pale wake. Sparrows burst from the garden rail before they dropped back down to peck at the gravel's edge. Annie Whitlock stepped out of the truck, a clipboard low and easy against her hip, her brown work boots taking the dirt without fuss. Dust clung to the edge of her jeans, proof she'd walked more back roads than office halls. She came straight toward him, not glancing at anything in the yard. Her hair slipped its tie, gold strands picking up the light, and she shoved it back. She was exactly as she'd always been after chasing one project too many across Bitterroot. Determined. A pencil was tucked behind her ear, half chewed, like she'd been solving several problems on the drive over. "Morning, Holt." She stopped a few feet shy of the fence, feet planted like she meant to grow roots, her eyes on him. "Morning, Whitlock." He peeled off a glove, buying a second. "You're a long way from the chamber office for a social call. Unless the chamber has started inspecting fence posts, I'm guessing you're here for something else. The Founders' Day Committee voted last night." She held the clipboard out. "Unanimous. You're a veteran, and they want you as Grand Marshal for the 4th of July parade." He didn't take the clipboard. "No." "You haven't heard the rest." "Don't need to." He kept his hands loose at his sides. "Plenty of veterans in this county who'd be glad for the honor. Ask any of them." "What an idea." Her fingers landed close enough to the rail to stir the mud. "Though there's exactly only one former Army chaplain living inside the town limits. The committee figured that fact matters. When you're asking somebody to carry a flag, that means a lot more than a decoration." She tilted her head, giving him the slow stare he remembered too well. The same emerald green eyes that had once talked him into jumping the creek behind the old schoolhouse on a dare. He shifted the brim of his hat. Being the only one doesn't make a man qualified for a podium. "But he's the guy the town remembers standing up in Mrs. Delaney's English class senior year," Annie replied. That guy talked about what service costs. Half of them still quote your speech when they want to guilt somebody into showing up for the Harvest Festival. You didn't even use notes. I sat 2 rows back, wondering how the boy, who never said 2 words in school, suddenly sounded like someone twice his age. I had plenty of notes, and I was 18. You didn't read from them. Her mouth hit a clean, confident slant, like she'd won a hand he was unaware of. Same as you not needing a script now. You don't want the job, plain and simple. A rough push of wind went through the grass, hauling the tang of cut hay off the lower pasture. They didn't touch what the wind left behind. He picked up her old cues. Small towns didn't let those fade. The real thing doesn't come with a marching band and free apple pie at the potluck afterward, he replied. No. Her thick black lashes dipped in a neat, deliberate beat. It starts with men like you coming home and deciding whether this country is worth standing up for. That one landed. Annie had always known how to aim. She ran the chamber office on more energy than the budget deserved and never missed a committee meeting. She propped herself in the dirt, immovable as a fence post. Levi's boots held in place, the urge to step back dying between thought and his next breath. I appreciate the offer. He meant that part. But I'm not your man. Sure you are. Her gaze held clear and sure, the kind that caused him to forget what he had planned to say. He shook his head. Try Pastor Greer, Pastor Michael's associate pastor. Man's been looking for an excuse to use a microphone since 1995. He's leaving town to visit family. She pulled a folded paper free. Here's the parade route and committee schedule. We could use a hand with sound equipment, chairs on the lawn. Might be a man can serve this town without standing on a flatbed in front of half the county. He asked, not a podium? She shrugged. Same difference, either way. He took the paper because refusing it seemed the impolite choice, clear as a closed door. Her fingers brushed his for the briefest instant. Thanks, but I won't change my mind. The paper crackled against his calluses, a reminder of how long it had been since he'd held anything lighter than a tool. Not today, but there's always tomorrow. She turned and approached her truck, her hand on the door. For what it's worth, my grandfather always said a town loses its soul when it forgets what it cost to keep the lights on. He'd have wanted somebody up there who understands the significance instead of reading off a card. She swung into the cab. You used to tell me you'd rather be the one who showed up than the one who explained later why he didn't. I came home from places where showing up got men killed, and I learned to ask first whether it was worth it. His thumb hooked the seam of his belt, and he pressed hard. Is that the answer you wanted? I'm not asking you to risk anything twice. I'm asking you to tell people what it cost. That's a different type of brave, and is the kind this town's short on. She closed the door before he replied. The engine turned over, a light lift in the air, trailing the exhaust in a stubborn drift. For reasons he couldn't explain, her tail lights disappearing was a little too much, like watching another chance leave without him. He studied the parade route with a practiced eye. Sun glanced off the paper, bright enough he had to angle it away from the whitewashed barn. July 4th, 9 sharp. Rodeo at noon, potluck on the church lawn at 5. Flag retirement at dusk, fireworks afterward. Annie's neat block letters along the bottom margin. Sound equipment volunteers required. Contact chamber office. He tucked the paper into the pocket of his shirt, the sun-worn fabric swallowing it. The maul was heavier when he picked it up again. He drove it into the next post, harder than it needed to be, the impact jolting up his arms and into his chest. The valley stretched wide around him, generous in a way he hadn't yet figured out how to accept. The mountains held the heat low, trapping the scent of thawed earth and last year's hay. Annie's voice remained long after the dust came to rest, stirring memories he'd buried behind calving season, broken gates, and dawn chores. Some days, work was enough. Some days it wasn't. Chapter 2. By 1 o'clock, the tiny chamber office was too small for Annie Whitlock's problems. The office sat above the hardware store in Bitterroot, 2 rooms and a window unit, losing a slow war against May. The air tasted faintly of old paper, the tired plastic smell of ancient binders, and a staleness that would only thicken once the real heat arrived. This month, Annie had spent more hours in the office than in her own kitchen. She dropped into a chair hard enough to send it rolling back an inch. The window unit rattled on, indifferent. A strand of hair, loosened by sweat, stuck to her temple. Levi had said no. She'd expected the refusal. What she hadn't expected was how disappointed she'd be that she wouldn't have another excuse to see him. Regret dropped into her like the hairline fracture running up the Grange Hall's east wall, small at first, certain to spread. Was Levi a hard sell? Mayor Dalton set one boot across her office's threshold, coffee cup in hand, his burgundy western shirt a shade too bright for a Tuesday. Sharp creases marked the knees of his jeans. He's a closed door. She pulled the grant folder toward her and didn't open it. She knew every line by heart. The funding tiers, the scoring rubric, the phrase demonstrated community engagement and turnout that had cost her more sleep than she wanted to admit. Don't worry, I'll find another option. You don't have time. Dalton's voice gentled, the tone he used right before delivering bad news. Lone Peak's booked that radio fellow out of Billings for their celebration. Annie ran the math she'd run 1,000,000 times. A live broadcast meant eyes well past the county line. Eyes meant turnout. Turnout was the only number the committee counted. Well, Lone Peak could keep its radio fellow. Bitterroot had the fireworks. Annie had spent hours on phone calls, 3 grant applications, and 1 deeply uncomfortable negotiation with the county fire marshal to bring in a display bigger than anything the valley had ever seen. 22 minutes, a finale the pyrotechnics company promised would be visible from 3 towns over. People forgot a voice on the radio by supper. Nobody forgot the night the whole sky opened above their hometown. She wanted this 4th of July talked about for the rest of people's lives. She intended to get her wish. Apparently that radio fellow's got a following, Dalton was saying. She sighed. Hopefully not too big of a following? He shrugged. He'd lived through enough budget seasons not to panic at every new wrinkle, even with real worry behind his gaze. I realize what's riding on it. She flattened her palms against the desk, the surface cool from the window unit's feeble effort. I have since the first letter came in March. The mayor set his mug on the corner of her desk, a habit she'd never managed to break him of. Your grandfather would have hated losing that building. We tied the hall into the grant, so our 4th looks bigger than Bunting. If we outdo the other towns, the money follows. She didn't answer. Didn't need to. The Grange Hall sat 3 blocks away, windows boarded, bones good. The place let off a whisper of old pine when the wind hit it right. She recalled standing beside her grandfather while the marching band played beneath strings of white lights, drums rattling along the folding chairs. Sweet iced tea, old-timers claiming benches, couples dancing after sunset, and its entire future rode on a grant that depended on Bitterroot outshining a town twice its size, with twice its budget. The hall was where the valley gathered for the bicentennial back in '76, her grandfather carrying her own father on his shoulders, the building lit gold from the inside while half the county crowded the sidewalk to get a look. He wanted it standing for the 250th celebration, too. He hadn't lived to see if it would make it. "I'll find a way," she murmured, mostly to convince herself. "You tried the obvious veterans. None of them fit." Dalton picked his mug up. "Levi Holt's the one who actually wore a chaplain's cross overseas. The committee wasn't wrong to want him. And you weren't wrong to ask him, from what I hear around town." She squared a stack of papers on her desk that didn't need squaring. "News travels fast, in 2 rooms above a hardware store." "That's true of everywhere here. It comes with everybody waving at everybody." Dalton offered the closest thing to a smile before heading back toward his own office. "Don't give up on him yet. A man like that doesn't say no because he doesn't care. He says no because he's carrying a reason he hasn't told you about." The mayor left her with that. Annie sat with the spreadsheet, the grant folder, the framed photograph of her grandfather in dress uniform, decades younger in that photo than she was now, his smile as easy as the one from childhood. She reached over and straightened the frame. "Show me the next step, Grandpa Henry," she whispered, the line so familiar she barely realized she'd spoken it aloud. She caught her own reflection in the dark window glass, his stubborn chin staring back, and not nearly enough sleep showing underneath it. That evening, after the hardware store below went dark, Annie stayed late and dug through a drawer of old committee files she hadn't opened in years. Behind a folder of expired vendor contracts was a stack of letters Grandpa Henry had written to the State Historical Society, each a careful, stubborn argument for why the Grange Hall mattered, why a building was never only brick and a leaking roof, but a place a town gathered to remember itself. One letter carried a coffee ring. The committee rejected his arguments 4 times before they passed. "Good for you, Grandpa," she whispered. Her tears left cool tracks on her skin that the room dried at the edges. "I'm doing my best to restore it." Instead of going home, she texted Mabel Sawyer. "Pie in a favor?" Annie asked. "Always." "Which kind?" "The kind where you tell me I'm not foolish for still thinking about Levi Holt." "Come sit. Today's pie special is cherry, which is basically a sign from above." She smiled through her tears. The town she was fighting for had first been loved by the man who taught her how. She wiped her cheeks, grabbed her keys, and marched to the door. Chapter 3. Sawyer's Diner had its usual aroma of coffee and bacon grease, reminding Levi of boyhood summers when he assumed the entire town belonged to somebody else's life. 6 booths lined the window, crammed so close that a person could overhear their neighbor's order unintentionally. The bell over the door gave its tired half-jingle, and a curly-haired Mabel Sawyer called a greeting from the counter without turning. The woman likely knew each regular by the sound of their boots alone. He hadn't planned on running into Annie, hadn't planned on the booth he picked landing one back from hers, as Mabel set a slice of cherry pie down with enough fanfare to suggest the entire eatery was privy to their discussion. "You look like a woman who got told no." Uninvited, Mabel slid in the seat across from Annie. "I'm a woman with a grant deadline and 1 veteran short of a flag ceremony," Annie replied. Levi kept his eyes on his coffee. His ears worked fine. Privacy wasn't a feature this diner offered. "Ask him differently," Mabel said. "Not the podium, not the entire production. Ask for the parts that don't require standing up in front of God and the county." "Such as?" Annie kept her voice low. "Logistics, setup. The stuff a man can agree to without feeling like he's volunteering for a sermon." Mabel didn't bother lowering her voice, and Levi suspected she'd built half her business on knowing exactly who needed to overhear what. "Let me tell you something. I had a rancher in here years ago, after he lost his boy in a hunting accident. He wouldn't speak 3 words to anybody for a winter straight. Then one day, I asked him to fix the bell over the door, nothing more, and he came back the next week to check that the hinges were holding. It took him half a year to finally say yes to dinner with my family. And he's been carving the turkey in my dining room every November since. Mabel patted the table once, the gesture of a woman closing a sale. Worth a try, isn't it? Half of getting somebody to come around is not handing them the entire mountain range on the first ask. Levi turned that over while he finished his coffee. He'd spent years telling other men that grief eased a little at a time. He'd never tried believing it about his own. I don't want to trick him, Annie was saying. Nobody said trick. Mabel clicked her tongue. I said try. Levi set his cup down with a dull thud. The sound wove through the diner's low chatter like a misplaced nail in a board. Annie swiveled. Mabel stared straight at him. Levi! Color came up in Annie's cheeks, the kind that rose from being caught rather than embarrassed proper. His name came soft and plain, the same as it used to before they learned to measure their words around each other. Annie. He nodded at Mabel. Mabel. Don't mind me. Mabel was sliding out of the booth, her smile as satisfied as a woman who'd gotten exactly what she came for. Got a kitchen to run, and you two don't need me in the middle of whatever this is. The diner buzzed, forks on plates. The radio behind the counter played an Alan Jackson tune, reflective and warm. I wasn't eavesdropping on purpose. Levi stood and grinned. Your voice is carried. Mabel probably planned it that way. Annie forked pie around her plate. Mabel's never cared about subtlety. We've both known that since we were 11. True. He picked up his coffee mug, taking the seat across from Annie without quite asking. For what it's worth, I heard the logistics part. She raised a delicate eyebrow. And? I'll help with the setup, route, sound equipment, chairs. He held up a hand before she read more into it. Not the podium, not the ceremony, only the parts nobody sees. That's more than I had a couple hours ago. A genuine smile, small, the first one that didn't look like it was working overtime to convince anybody of anything. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. I haven't done a thing. He meant that lightly, but the line between behind the scenes and standing in front of a crowd was thin, and this woman had a habit of closing distances a man considered bolted. She'd managed it in the 5th grade, too, taking the empty seat beside him on his first day at Bitterroot Elementary, 3 schools in 3 states behind him, by age 10, fresh off the move from Helena to live with his uncle, before anybody else had worked up the nerve to speak to him. I've got a donkey at home who thinks volunteering is contagious, and I'd rather not catch it twice, he added. Barnaby? Yep. That donkey must be what, 20 years old at least? 25. Well, now that we have that established, when can you start? Annie reached for her clipboard, the businesslike efficiency dropping back over her shoulders. Tomorrow, if you need me. Ranch mornings, town afternoons. This time of year. Sparrow Creek Ranch was his property to run now. Nobody else's, except for his full-time ranch hand, Dale. Tomorrow is fine. Annie scribbled several words, glanced up, and for 1 second the coat slipped, a softened edge showing through underneath it. I mean it. Thank you, Levi. Her voice dropped a shade, cutting through the diner noise. He nodded. You're welcome, Annie. He left a tip. The warmth following him home was only the Montana sun. It wasn't Annie. He repeated the lie all the way back to the ranch, and by the time he reached his front gate, he almost believed it. Chapter 4. The county vendor fair, set up every June out past the town of Lone Peak, a sprawl of booths and food trucks, where every chamber of commerce in the valley staked a table and traded brochures Nobody read twice. The fairgrounds sat in a broad field bordered by cottonwoods and pasture land, the sun bleaching the grass pale gold. Generators hummed beneath vendor tents. School kids darted between booths, clutching cups of lemonade and bags of kettle corn. Ranchers leaned against pickup trucks, discussing rainfall, cattle prices, and everyone else's business. The smell of grilled burgers and onions mixed with horse sweat and sunscreen. With reluctance, Annie had traveled to the nearby town on Saturday with Mayor Dalton, largely because skipping the fair was exactly a weakness that Lone Peak's committee would relish clocking. Renee Castillo, Lone Peak's chamber director, tracked Annie down inside of 20 minutes, somehow always locating her before Annie located the coffee stand. "I hoped you'd be here." As always, Renee's appearance was polished, smoothing her dark hair into place despite the wind whipping through the fairgrounds. Not a wrinkle showed in her tailored red blouse, the color chosen, no doubt, because it matched Lone Peak's town logo. Annie wore a sleeveless cotton sundress the color of faded denim, a Grange Hall fundraiser pin fastened near her collar. She'd pulled her hair back in a braid that had nothing to do with fashion and everything to do with the breeze. A canvas tote slung over one shoulder, heavy with raffle tickets and a roll of tape. "I'm finishing our broadcast schedule." Renee's smile carried no actual friendliness. "Have you settled on your veteran yet?" "Rumor is there was trouble finding anyone willing." "We've got a wonderful program coming together." Annie kept her tone light, refusing Renee the satisfaction of reading the truth off her statement. "I'm sure you do." Renee patted her arm, though the gesture landed as condescension. "These little details always work out. Best of luck, truly." She strolled back to her booth, the banner twice the size of Bitterroot's, an enlarged photo of last year's parade looming behind the table. A gust lifted the edge, snapping the banner against the frame. Lone Peak always seemed to have more money, more volunteers, and more confidence than Bitterroot. Whether any of those were true hardly mattered. People believed they did. The old knot in Annie's stomach pulled tight. She bought a cup of lemonade, joined Mayor Dalton near his truck, and they drove home mostly in silence, two people independently running the same worrying math. 5 days later, walking the parade route in Bitterroot with Levi on a Thursday evening, the streets sat empty enough to pace the stretch from the feed store to the church lawn without dodging traffic. Levi jotted notes on where the sound equipment needed power and where the rodeo trailers staged their spots, avoiding the fire lane. The evening brought the scent of asphalt, still warm from the afternoon, and the subtle sweetness of lilacs hanging from a hedge. They passed the bakery, the hardware store with its rakes out front, and the white church set back from the road, all the buildings softening Main Street once June had edged in for good. Levi moved more easily out here than behind his own fence. "Power drop for the soundboard," he said, tapping the pole by the feed store. "And you'll want the fireworks crew staging at the fairgrounds by 6, not 7. 22 minutes of shells takes longer to rack than people think." "You've been reading my clipboard." "I've been carrying your clipboard." He clicked the tape measure closed. "It's a decent show. Bozeman does 30. "Bozeman does not do 30. "Bozeman has done 30 since I was in college. Finale over the Bridgers. People drive in from 2 counties. "People drive in from 2 counties because there is nothing else to do in Bozeman." She aimed her pen at him. "And I'll remind you that your Bobcats lost to my Grizzlies 3 straight years, so your credibility on hometown bragging runs thin." He said, "Missoula counts wins about like they count fireworks." He settled his hat lower, but not before she caught the grin beneath it. "Generously." She grinned back, watching him more than the job required. not because he was handsome, though he was. The years had left their mark in faint lines around his slate blue eyes and a seriousness that hadn't been there when they were younger. The sleeves of his faded work shirt rolled to his muscled forearms, exposed skin darkened by years of ranching, broken by a scar that curved too clean to be an accident with barbed wire. Brown hair curled from under his hat, overdue for a cut. A tape measure rode on his belt beside a pocket knife worn smooth. He wore an easy competence that drew attention without asking. She cataloged items about him she had no business cataloging. How he measured distances by eye before checking his tape, and was always right. How he greeted every person by name, even the ones who'd moved to town after he'd returned from overseas. The woman from the bakery sidled up to him outside the hardware store and spent 10 minutes talking about her son's grades at Montana State, worrying the strings of her apron. Mr. Kincaid cornered Levi by the feed store to complain about his cardiologist, his voice rising through the first 2 minutes and leveling low and even by the 4th minute. "You're cheaper than my doctor, and you listen better," Mr. Kincaid told him, jabbing a finger at Levi's chest. Levi grinned and allowed this was probably true on both counts. He never offered advice. He nodded, asked a question or two, and had the uncanny ability to let the gaps between sentences do the rest. Both people walked off lighter than they'd arrived. Levi reminded Annie of Grandpa Henry at his best, the rare gift of making a person feel understood without making a show of listening, though a sadness sat beneath it all. A shadow passed over his expression when he assumed no one was looking. A distance in his eyes suggested part of him lived far beyond Bitterroot. Whatever waited on the other side was the same thing that kept him out of every pew in town on a Sunday. "So your grandfather started the ceremony," Levi said, as they stepped by Sam Shore's barber shop, the pole turning slow in the window, stripes faded but still turning. The place had been there for ages. "Yes, 40 years ago." She slowed. "He came home from Vietnam in 72. Never talked about it much, not to my dad, not to me." They passed a row of trees before she spoke again. "But every Founder's Day he'd fold up the flags, too worn to fly, and retire them proper. He said it was the one task he knew how to do right by the men who didn't come home." Levi didn't ask anything. He slowed his own pace to match hers. She kept her eyes on the sidewalk, the old trick of bracing herself by watching her own feet. She sighed. "He passed away 3 years ago." Levi didn't offer the easy condolence she'd experienced more times than she could count, the kind people gave because their own discomfort needed filling more than her loss. He walked beside her, leaving the space open, and that landed gentler than any conversation. Levi turned to her and asked, "I remember seeing him in town." "What was he like?" he asked. "Beyond the ceremony." Annie stopped at the corner and studied the crosswalk sign as if the answer was written on it. "He was stubborn and funnier than you'd expect. He used to sneak me peppermints during church when I was small and swore it was our secret, even though my mother always recognized exactly where the smell came from." For a second, she imagined her grandfather sitting beside her in the creaky wooden pew, slipping her a peppermint while pretending to study the hymnal. The memory arrived so clearly it stole her breath. "He taught me to drive stick shift in the church parking lot. He said a woman ought to know how to handle a vehicle, in case she ever needed an exit. Nobody saw coming." Levi smiled. "He's a man worth missing." "He is." The present tense slipped out. She didn't bother correcting it. They'd nearly reached the church lawn, the last light of day skimming the bell tower. Down the block, a screen door slammed, and laughter drifted from a backyard barbecue. Bitterroot was peaceful enough to convince a person that troubles could wait until morning. Her phone buzzed, an email from the Veterans Memorial Committee. She opened it how she opened every email, ready for trouble before it had the chance to surprise her. She stopped. "What is it?" Levi asked. "The Reyes family." She read the email twice to confirm. "Carol Reyes confirmed travel for herself and her husband, Marcus. They'll be here for the dedication." And she asked specifically for you to give the remarks. Her son wrote home about Chaplain Holt enough times she'd recognize your name anywhere. Levi froze, every muscle locked in place. The fading sunlight sharpened the planes of his face, and for an instant a rawness appeared beneath his careful composure. The measuring tape hung in his hand, apparently forgotten. Annie lifted her head from the email. "Levi?" He shook his head and spoke softly. "I had no idea they'd contacted her directly." His voice flattened, careful. The same careful she'd clocked the first day at the ranch fence. "I asked the memorial committee for a paver when I moved back. That's all. Now it grew into a bench, and they invited his mother?" "So you knew Corporal Reyes well?" "Yes." His gaze traveled beyond Annie's shoulder, past the church lawn, past Bitterroot entirely. She'd glimpsed flashes of it, the same distance, the same shadow. Whatever waited in those memories had followed him home. He said, "I need to get back. To apologize, maybe? Explain." He dragged a hand across the back of his neck. "Can I give you a ride home?" She shook her head. "I'm fine. My apartment is only a few blocks away, and I'll walk." He left before she asked any questions, his truck pulling away faster than the empty street called for. Annie stood on the sidewalk, phone still lit, the email glowing up at her like a question she didn't have the right to ask. Chapter 5. Levi's truck trailed over washboard roads, sagebrush flying past the windows in muted green streaks. The Bitterroot mountains held blue against the evening sky, unconcerned with the pinch riding under his ribs. He didn't ease off until the gate to his ranch appeared, gravel spitting under his tires. He sat in the truck a long while, both hands on the wheel, his calloused fingers locked tight. A gelding lifted its head and nickered, recognizing the truck before Levi even opened the door and forced himself to go inside. Normally, the familiar greeting comforted him. Tonight, it only reminded him he'd made it home when Danny hadn't. Danny Reyes had been 22, a corporal out of Sacramento, with a laugh that rang clean across a chow hall, and a habit of asking questions most soldiers kept to themselves. He claimed desert coffee tasted like burnt motor oil and always had Hubba Bubba, Max chewing gum in his uniform's breast pocket. He offered a stick to everyone before the patrol and encouraged huge bubble-blowing competitions with the other soldiers during downtime. He kept a folded photograph of his parents tucked inside his Bible, the edges worn white from being opened so often. Once he'd confessed he planned to marry his high school sweetheart after his enlistment ended. "She's asking for a wraparound porch," he'd said with a grin. "Guess I'd better learn how to build one." Levi had laughed and promised to officiate the wedding if Danny would stop trying to recruit him into helping with the carpentry. Danny's grin only widened. He'd shown up to every chapel service Levi held, not because the Army required it, but because Danny chose to be there, asking about grace, about whether faith held up under fire the same way it held up in his chapel back home. Levi expected polite nods from soldiers who attended chapel because they assumed they ought to. Danny wanted answers, and he never pretended otherwise. Often, he reminded Levi of what hope looked like before the world finished testing it, before headlines and folded flags and unanswered prayers carved away at a man's certainty. Even overseas, Danny trusted that tomorrow would come with a life worth living. Levi had envied that without realizing it at the time. He went inside his house while the evening dimmed. A chipped mug of coffee waited where he'd abandoned it that morning. He picked it up out of habit, though it had gone cold. He didn't bother making a second cup. Leather tack hanging in the mudroom gave off its familiar blend of saddle soap and worn hide, comforting scents he'd known since childhood. Outside, another horse neighed, followed by the scrape of a hoof against the corral fence. Home surrounded him, with a life he'd once trusted to steady his soul. Tonight, nothing reached far enough. Loneliness had become so familiar, it sometimes masqueraded as peace. He eyed the pan on the stove, the greasy fried potatoes and salt pork. He'd gotten proficient at cooking for one, proficient and weary from it. He left the lights off, sat at the kitchen table, and let himself remember the rest of the memory. The convoy had set out at dawn, a routine resupply, the kind they'd run 24 times without trouble. The desert air shimmered with heat, diesel fuel, and dust before the sun had cleared the horizon. Soldiers checked tires, tightened straps, and traded the easy banter born from repeating the same route too often to count. Levi prayed over the vehicles as he always did, hands on the hood of the lead truck, asking the Lord to bring every one of them home. Danny beamed at him from beside the second vehicle and stated it like a fact, that Chaplain Holt's prayers got them back safe every single time, guaranteed. Then he tapped the cross hanging around his neck, winked, and tossed a Hubba Bubba Max gum wrapper to Levi before climbing in. "Extra insurance, Chaplain." Levi laughed, shook his head at the boy's confidence, and swung up into the third vehicle, never imagining how desperately he'd cling to the remembrance of that morning. They were halfway back to their plywood barrack at camp when the blast took Danny's vehicle. The sound arrived through the ground first, up through the floorboards and into Levi's teeth, and then the world outside the windshield went brown. He was out and running before the dust settled, before anyone gave an order, boots hammering hardpan while smoke rolled off the wreck ahead of him. He prayed while he ran. "Please, Lord, please." 2 words over and over. All the seminary in him burned down to that. He reached Danny and took his hand. The rest lived in him in pieces he'd never managed to sand smooth. The heaviness of a young man's fingers closing around his, a medic shouting for a line, Danny's eyes finding his through the dust, holding on, expecting the chaplain to fix it. Levi couldn't. Danny spoke twice before the end, a question and then a message. Levi had repeated neither to a living soul. The question he'd answered with the last full certainty of his life. The message belonged to 2 people in Sacramento, and he had written it into a letter 4 times and mailed none of them, because a message like that deserved better carriage than an envelope. He knelt in the dirt of a foreign road, holding the hand of a boy who trusted him to the end. The gum wrapper surfaced weeks later, folded into the seam of his uniform, and he stared at it far longer than made any sense. 3 days after, he stood in front of Danny's unit with the prayer book trembling in hands that wouldn't hold, and located a spot on the wall above the soldiers' heads to aim his voice at, because meeting any of their eyes might have ended the eulogy before it began. The desert wind pushed at the flag draped over the casket, lifting a corner. Boots lined the packed ground in perfect rows. No one shifted. Every face brought the same exhausted disbelief, as though they were all waiting for someone to explain how a young man who joked about building a porch 3 mornings earlier had become a folded flag instead. Levi opened with a line about God's plans never going to waste. The word stuck behind his teeth, before he got through it, and he had to stop, swallow, and start again. His voice sounded unfamiliar, thinner than usual, almost as though someone else had taken his place. His thumb worried the edge of the prayer book, tracing grooves left by years of use. He'd answered God's call to ministry, yet the scripture felt painfully heavy in his hands. He tried a different line, that grace covers even the men who don't make it home. His voice held until covers, then split clean down the middle, and he stood there with 24 faces, waiting for an end to a sentence he didn't have. Near the front, a sergeant stared straight ahead. Beside him, another soldier removed his cap and twisted it between both hands. A young private, barely old enough to shave every day, watched Levi with desperate hope. They weren't asking for perfect answers. They were asking him to trust what he'd already spoken. By the time he finished, he didn't believe a word. A man no older than 19 cried without bothering to hide it. Another stared at the floor so hard his jaw shivered. A guy in the third row twisted his wedding band. Levi understood, with a clarity that had never left him, that he was the last man in that formation who had any business holding a Bible. The sounds weren't loud. Only a broken breath escaped before a man covered his face. No one turned. No one told him to pull himself together. Grief had stripped rank from every unit member standing there. After the service, a private caught up with Levi before he reached the chapel tent. "Chaplain?" His voice cracked. "You really think Danny heard all that?" Levi opened his mouth, needing to answer with certainty. Instead, he rested a hand on the soldier's shoulder and murmured, "I hope so." Hope. Not know. He hadn't given a sermon since. He still believed God worked miracles. He wasn't sure men like him were allowed to ask for one anymore. He sat at the table until full dark took the valley, the old grief moving through him slow and total. Weather rolled in off the ridgeline. It didn't announce itself. It gathered until any regrets inside a man locked in place. In the living room, a clock ticked. An owl called twice from beyond the yard, sharp and hollow. Wind moved through the cottonwoods, rubbing leaf against leaf in a dry, restless muffle. A floorboard dipped with a weak protest. He didn't bother to check. The cold cup sat untouched on the table while he stared into nothing. The words he should have said kept circling, unchanged by time. Certainty, comfort, solid enough to hold a breaking man together. What would it mean to stand in front of this town and truly believe? He didn't figure on a reply, but he faced the question, and that alone was more ground gained than he'd managed in a year and a half. Chapter 6. 4 days afterwards, a weak glint off the grass reflected the silver strands of barbed wire and turned the dew on the grass into scattered diamonds. A meadowlark flew to the top strand of barbed wire, singing as though the world had never known sorrow. Levi envied a creature that trusted morning would always come. Fragrant wildflowers wafted on a breeze, and Annie's smile came to his mind before he could stop himself. The loose strand of hair she'd tucked behind her ear when she came to his ranch had occupied far too much of his attention for a man rebuilding fences. He'd nearly finished filling the water trough when 2 pickup trucks bumped across the shared lane. Reed Calloway pulled up with his daughter, Stella, riding in the truck bed, technically breaking every safety rule Reed had ever lectured anybody else about, but Levi was glad enough for the company not to mention it. Reed's wife, Lily, trailed behind in her own truck. "They both insisted," Reed explained, giving a shrug. He helped Stella down, while Lily climbed out of her truck holding a tin. Warm cinnamon, baked apples, and butter escaped, filling the cool June air with a scent that belonged in kitchens where families lingered after supper. Stella wanted to see your horses, Reed continued, and Lily insisted on baking dessert, so I figure we're square. I insisted because Stella told me Mr. Holt looks like he forgets to eat, Lily said. Supper's usually whatever's fastest, Levi replied. Dale says I cook like a man being punished for a crime. Lily grinned and lifted the tin. They're apple bars. Eat them. And don't argue with a child's diagnosis. You've got a ranch to run. Thanks. I've got 2 horses and a 25-year-old donkey who thinks he's a horse and believes every animal on the property reports to him. Levi replied, That's a start. Lily inspected the kitchen garden along the post and wires and frowned. Grass had pushed through the rows, lettuce gone to seed, and thistles stood where beans should have been. The soil lay dry and split, vines pulling sideways, the whole plot showing how long it had been left to itself. Want me to put the bars on your porch? Levi nodded. Sure, he said. Thanks again. You're welcome. She strolled to his house, then returned. I'm off to catch up with Grace. She's teaching me how to make black bean soup, bad enough that I had to learn how to bake. Reed chuckled, and I'm loving every minute of it. He stepped over to kiss his wife as she got into her truck. See you later. Bye, Mom. Stella skipped halfway to the paddock fence and gave a wave. Reed and Levi leaned on Reed's truck as Stella counted the animals out loud. 1, 2, 5. Stella's eyebrows pinched together. Wait, that brown horse is trotting away, and there might be a dragon hiding in the barn. Reed chuckled, the sound rusty, as though he hadn't expected to laugh today. Math's never been your strongest subject, Pumpkin. She planted both hands on her hips. The brown one keeps walking. That makes him count twice. Levi surprised himself by smiling. It tugged at muscles that hadn't been used much lately. That's one way to do ranch arithmetic. Tell you what, we'll call it 5.5, and the dragon can stay anonymous. Stella nodded, apparently delighted that they'd finally caught on. You've been scarce, Reed said, eyes on his daughter. The question pitched low enough that Levi could let it slide by if he wanted to. Levi lifted a feed bucket, then shifted it to his other hand. Parade committee. Heard that. Reed tipped his hat back a notch and rested both forearms across the truck door, studying the pasture instead of Levi. I heard about the Reyes family, too. Small town. Levi didn't answer. He hooked the bucket on a fence rail and left it swinging. Stella's tiny fingers gripped the splintered edge of a hay bale, and Levi's ribs drew in on a breath. His hand came down on the bale, his gut outrunning reason. Stella laughed, unaware she'd awakened every protective instinct he'd carried overseas. He anchored the bale, though it hardly needed anchoring, and didn't let go until she'd caught her balance. You don't have to tell me anything. Reed picked at a curl of paint flaking off the truck's door. We're different men than we were as kids. He didn't finish. Stella stated that the dragon needed a name, and both men let the silence run a few seconds past what the joke required. True grace finds a man eventually, Reed continued, whether he's looking for it or not. Levi said, Stella's mother. Levi set his boots a little wider. 5 years this fall. Took me longer than I'd like to admit. Reed picked another curl of paint. Grieving alone doesn't make a man stronger. Makes him lonelier, and it spreads that hurting to everybody around him. Stella jumped off and scrambled to the ground. Daddy said you used to talk to soldiers about God when they were scared. Is that true, Mr. Holt? She brushed the dirt from her jeans. Levi's chest pulled inward. It's true. Why don't you talk to anybody about God now? Her question hit plain and straight, no tact softening it, no instinct telling her to leave the hard thing unsaid. Reed opened his mouth, perhaps to redirect her, but Levi waved him off. Behind the barn, a meadowlark sang. If only answers came as easily as birdsong. Levi said, I think maybe I got scared myself. Tough to talk to people about being brave when you don't feel brave. He crouched to her height. Stella's braid had mostly come undone, and she shoved the loose strands back from her face. My mom died. Dad was scared too. Then Lily came. She picked at a piece of hay stuck to her sleeve. Some kids get one mom and some kids get two, and both count the same. Levi crouched there for another beat, turning her words over the way he might turn over a stone, looking for what was underneath it. Sometimes grown-ups lose their footing too, Reed added. Levi didn't have a ready response, but a crack opened in his chest, enough light getting through that he had to stand and turn toward the fence for a second so they wouldn't notice the trace of tears in his eyes. Stella kicked a pebble. Dad says talking about the hard stuff is how come it doesn't stay so heavy. She's not wrong. Reed stepped beside Levi. I wish somebody had told me that sooner. It could have saved me a couple of challenging years. Reed let it sit without comment, the gift of a friend who understood more than he was saying. He called Stella back toward the truck a few minutes later, citing supper waiting. She waved at Levi from the truck's passenger window, both hands like she meant for him to see her from as far off as possible. Levi lingered at the fence long after they'd gone. Powdered clay floated over the drive until the tire tracks hardened into the road. A horse lifted its head and snorted before returning to graze, as though nothing remarkable had happened. Yet a current had shifted. Danny Reyes's smile surfaced in Levi's mind before the explosion. Chapter 7. 2 days later, Levi stepped onto the porch with a pair of gloves hooked in his fingers, the boards holding the night's coolness. Down in the yard, the horse's tacks jingled in easy-going, uneven notes. He rolled his shoulders, working out the stiffness from yesterday's ride, and strode to the barn. Sparrow Creek was still home, though he wasn't at home inside himself anymore. A low band of light shone on the neat curls of wire, one post at a time. Uncle Cal used to say the Lord rarely hurried daylight. Maybe healing didn't arrive all at once. Near the shed, he set an empty bucket down with a clatter, its swing ending in a dull knock, his hand resting on the worn handle. The horses shifted in the paddock, hooves against packed earth, tails flicking at flies. A killdeer's cry skittered across the yard, hard to ignore. Same sound, same picturesque land, different weight to it today, though the memory didn't leave. It stirred every time the wind changed direction. Danny Reyes's smile surfaced when Levi wasn't looking for it, mid-step between the trough and the fence line, in the area between one breath and the next. Not the explosion, the smile. That was new. He'd spent several seasons afraid that Danny's face would bring the explosion with it. Now, memory had chosen mercy. He should return to the barn, should check the west fence where the wire had sagged since spring, or the 2 summer hands Dale had hired for haying. Should have done any number of things that required movement. He kept still, because stillness was where the memory lived. Danny's voice came next, neither loud nor dramatic. Regular. He'd asked for an extra minute on a smoke break and complained about boots that never fit right, the kind of voice you didn't think about losing until it was gone. Levi exhaled slowly through his nose and pushed away from the shed. Work, he said under his breath, as if order anchored him back into the day. Work had always been the one language grief couldn't interrupt. The ranch was the ranch. The fence needed wire. The trough needed checking. The world demanded hands in labor, in attention. And yet, for the first time, the past didn't feel like the only place Danny existed. Decorating Day was scheduled the second Saturday of June. The entire square gone under red, white, and blue bunting. The gazebo wrapped in lights. Annie claimed the latter duty nobody else wanted, hanging flags along the eaves, while half the volunteers wrestled hay bales into parade staging. Levi was there by mid-morning, bracing the ladder before she even registered he'd arrived. She hadn't even realized the ladder had shifted until his hand steadied it. He noticed the kind of details that most people walked past. "You're supposed to have a spotter for that," he said. "Had one. I got pulled to unload rodeo chutes 20 minutes ago." She set the last flag and started down. His hand came up to brace the ladder's sway, his palm warm on her hip as she took the final rung. He let go the instant both her boots reached the ground, as though kindness had edges he was afraid to cross, as though he was careful not to presume she needed him. "I can spot you the rest of the day," he offered. "I'm available." She asked, "Are you?" He nodded, a possibility. His answer was ordinary, though it dipped beneath her ribs, where ordinary answers had no business. "Careful, I might take you up on that." "Dale's got the ranch till dark. He informed me this morning that if I continued to hang around underfoot one more Saturday, he'd start charging me rent." She grinned and stepped nearer, closer than required, neither of them in any hurry to widen the gap. His scent was cedar and clean sweat and a trace of coffee. "You've gotten good at showing up exactly when I need an extra set of hands." "I have practice." "At showing up or at hands?" That got him. A real laugh, short and surprised, the kind he clearly hadn't planned on giving away. She wished she'd been the reason more than once. She tucked the sound away, as though she'd stumbled across a rare bird that might never land within reach again. "Both, apparently," he replied. His eyes held hers a beat too long for casual conversation before he stepped back, putting sensible distance between them. He knelt and tested the gazebo's bottom step, a palm flat against the wood. Annie let the silence sit while he adjusted his hat. "Well?" she finally asked. "Steps solid." She grinned. "How solid?" "Solid as my uncle's opinions." He stood. "Twice as stubborn." "Your uncle and my grandfather would have been best friends." One side of Levi's mouth came up, though he wrestled it back down like grinning outright might cost him $1. By early afternoon, a list of him had continued to form in her brain, sleeves rolled to the elbow and never rolled back down, a thin line of dirt across his square jaw he never bothered to wipe. The particular tilt of his hat when he concentrated, pushed back far enough that his eyes narrowed at a misshapen board like it had personally wronged him. He never seemed aware of himself, never checked whether anyone was watching. Everything about him was unpracticed, which made him impossible to ignore. "That one's crooked," she said, pointing. He squinted at it. "If we leave it alone long enough, somebody'll call it rustic." He drove the nail anyway, 3 clean strikes. He never hurried a job. He worked as though the next 5 decades depended on getting this one right. At 2:00, a boy from the high school cut across the square with a tray, 2 chicken salad sandwiches, and splashes of apple juice over ice, sliding toward the edge of the tray with every stride. Levi hooked the gazebo door open with the toe of his boot, and Annie cleared a spot on the steps, brushing honeysuckle petals off the wood with her sleeve. Levi unwrapped both sandwiches, laid out several napkins, then whispered a blessing. His prayer lasted only a few seconds, spoken soft enough that she recognized only "thank you" and "amen." What other prayers did he carry after all he'd lived through? Annie smiled and said, "This looks good. Half the folks here have decided I can't feed myself." The other half is correct. A woman, a couple doors down, wobbled on a stepladder, stringing paper flags between porch posts. A miniature dachshund trotted past, trailing a red ribbon and a leash with no child attached to either end. Someone hollered, "Biscuit!" at a volume that suggested Biscuit had no intention of stopping. Levi didn't so much as turn his head. The town's got 2 speeds today, frantic, and whatever Biscuit's doing. Annie opened her mouth to agree and closed it again, because agreeing meant admitting she found him funnier than she had any business finding him. Her attention dropped to his hands as he turned his sandwich, taking his time, like the afternoon had nowhere else to be. Years of ranching had taken whatever softness a young man's hands might have kept, knuckles broad, another scar, this one thin and pale along his thumb. Those weren't simply working hands. They were careful hands. Levi repaired broken things instead of throwing them away. What had put the scar there? Was this the kind of information a man volunteered, or the kind a woman had to earn the right to ask? His strong hands built fences, calmed frightened horses, and carried more than they ever discussed. They'd also be the kind that reached first when someone else was hurting. The square filled in with flags and ribbon in its usual chaos. Marlene, Annie's neighbor, wrestled a banner that kept folding in on itself. A staple gun snapped in short bursts from the gazebo rail, and a trumpet practiced a melody off key. 250 years of a country, and Annie Whitlock, sitting on a step with a half-eaten sandwich, kept a private inventory of a rancher's hands. She set the sandwich on her lap. "Can I ask you a question, Levi?" "You can ask. Don't know if it will go any further than that." "Why stay at the ranch? You could have sold it." "Plenty would have, coming back to a place where the only family you had left died." He set his empty cup against his boot, his thumb rubbing the rim. "Uncle Cal never asked what I'd seen overseas. Never pushed me to talk before I was ready." "A good uncle." "A great one. He handed me a curry comb the first summer I showed up and told me the fastest way to know an animal was to put your hands on it daily till it quit being a stranger." "Are you a stranger?" "Some." He gave the smallest nod, and his gaze skimmed the square. He said trust couldn't be rushed. Turns out people aren't much different. "Your turn," he continued. 4 years at the University of Montana, and a marketing degree that could have carried you anywhere. Why the Bitterroot Chamber Office?" "There was a man in Bozeman who asked me a version of that question." She brushed a crumb from her dress. "He offered a ring with one condition attached. Billings, a bank job, and no more Bitterroot. Then my grandfather's heart gave him trouble that same spring. I drove home for a weekend and never packed the boxes to leave again." "Any regrets?" "1 or 2 on the coldest February nights." She met his eyes. "None that survived till morning." "A grizzly!" He shook his head slowly. "My uncle would have nearly disowned me if I shook your grandfather's hand come November." She smiled and eyed the parade banners fluttering above Main Street. She wanted to tell him he belonged here and that he'd always belonged. Every person in town would say the same. She sloshed around the apple juice in her cup. Some truths needed to be discovered, not handed over. They spent the afternoon moving along the gazebo, one bulb at a time, the hours slipping by in the rhythm of it. Past the butcher shop, Stella Calloway struggled with a box nearly as big as she was. Before Annie took 3 steps, Levi rushed to her side. He knelt and retied the red ribbon on her braid, whispered something that earned a grin, and tipped his hat as Reed strode over. Annie smiled as Levi walked away. Kindness seemed to come as naturally to him as breathing, provided no one noticed. He was the most compelling kind of man there was, the kind who never once asked to be admired. Volunteers loitered as the light dimmed, leaving Annie and Levi to finish the last strand of banners. He walked her to her truck and held the door for her. For a breath, her hand on the frame, and his warmth rolling off him in the cooling air, it seemed like he might close that last gap between them. He didn't. He stepped back, his hand finding his pocket, like he needed a place to put it. "Drive safe," he said, before turning toward his own truck. She eased in behind the wheel, but didn't reach for the key. For one impossible second, she'd been certain he'd kiss her. Maybe she'd imagined it. Maybe she'd simply wanted it badly enough to mistake kindness for a promise. As she drove away, she glimpsed him in the rearview mirror. He stood exactly where she'd left him, hat pushed back, one hand in his pocket, watching until her truck disappeared around the corner. Chapter 8. Annie hadn't intended to bring the box. She carried it down from the hall closet the night before. Now it sat on the kitchen table, its fitted lid closed, like a letter she wasn't ready to open. The weight surprised her, though it shouldn't have. An acid-free cardboard box was surprisingly rigid and heavy for its size, slate gray and chalky to the touch. "I'll sort through it after the 4th, she muttered to the bare kitchen. Once the parade banners came down, once the speeches were over, once the town returned to regular days, and she could grieve without one eye on a checklist. When Levi knocked on the screen door, her fingers chose the box first, tracing the sharp metal rivets before she reached for her clipboard. "My grandfather's," she explained to him as she opened the door. "I've been meaning to go through it before the ceremony, but I haven't had the heart." "You will, when it sits right with you." He hesitated. "You are beautiful, Annie." Heat washed up her neck. "Thanks," she whispered. In her favorite pale yellow summer dress, the cotton airy against her skin, she experienced a gaze from him that simultaneously reassured and unnerved the guarded places inside her. He didn't miss a beat as he picked up the box without remarking on it. "You ready?" he asked, holding the door open for her. "All set." The short drive passed, easy and subdued. Gravel whispered beneath the truck's tires. A pair of red-winged blackbirds lifted from the ditch, flashing crimson against fields, silvered by early light. Wind carried the faint mineral coolness of a fast creek through the open windows, stirring a loose bit of hair flat across her neck. Her grandfather used to lower the windows no matter the weather. "That's the valley waking up," he'd say, inhaling as though the air itself deserved gratitude. So many of his everyday habits were sacred keepsakes she kept close. Levi's hand stayed easy on the wheel. He didn't fill their lack of conversation with words. Certain men understood the value of allowing silence to bear the heavy burden. He parked his truck beside the community center and came around to open her door. "I'll grab the chairs too," he said, as he lifted the box from her hands. "Thanks. I'll get the sign-in sheets," she replied. Inside the center, morning sunlight pooled across the polished maple floor, turning lazily as if the room hadn't yet decided to wake. Coffee percolated in the kitchen, rich and familiar, mingling with lemon oil rubbed into old wood every Friday by volunteers who claimed the building deserved tending as much as any home. Levi set the box on a table, then moved through the rows of folding chairs, nudging one an inch here, another a half inch there, until each line was straight. Annie smiled and took a seat. "You've done this before." He glanced over his shoulder. "My mother was convinced that crooked chairs reflected a crooked character." A laugh escaped her. "That's specific." She had opinions. He straightened the last chair. "She passed when I was 9. I don't own much of hers. A hymnal with her maiden name in it and her wedding ring in a drawer at the ranch. Uncle Cal kept both for me until I was grown." I gathered, Annie replied softly. His mouth tipped upward in a fleeting smile that vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. Yet she caught it. Hopefully, it would stay longer next time. He carried the last stack of chairs toward the stage before gesturing to her box. You want to get to this? It looks like a miniature vault. She nodded. That's one way to put it. His expression changed, not curiosity exactly, an awareness, as though he understood this wasn't just another task on today's list. She rested her fingertips on the lid. This has been sitting in my closet since the funeral. Not entirely true. It had been sitting in her life, always there, always waiting. I hope there'll be a day when opening it won't hurt. She gave a small shake of her head. Though I don't think that day is ever coming. Levi stopped beside the table. You have no obligation to open it if you're not ready. Right. She drew a slow breath. But I should. The crisp cardboard released with a vacuumed sigh. Cedar greeted her first, then wool, then the faded scent of paper that had weathered decades without protest. This wasn't merely a smell. This belonged to Saturday mornings in her grandparents' house, a cedar-lined closet, her grandmother humming hymns while folding blankets, and long summer afternoons wrapped in stories Annie had once imagined she'd keep forever. She slipped both hands beneath the folded service jacket. The wool had grown denser with time, the weave firm. Brass buttons reflected thin crescents of sunlight, each polished so often she'd forgotten they hadn't always shone that brightly. My grandmother refused to let them tarnish, Annie murmured. Levi pulled up a chair. Even after your grandfather stopped wearing it. She stared until the letters blurred. I haven't read this. Not once. The admission scraped against her throat. If I turned it over? She stopped. I expected I'd hear his voice. The original script? Levi asked. Her breath thinned. Word for word, what he said every year. She held the card out before her courage failed. Levi took it with both hands and his full attention and read it through twice, his lips moving over one line near the end. Levi tapped the card. This is good work. He understood his actions. Plain, true, no excess. The words mattered less than the silence. He'd have liked hearing that from you. Her eyes burned. She braced for the usual hold tight, but the moment passed right through her. I miss him so much it stops me cold some mornings, like the missing forgets to wait its turn. Levi turned his chair to face her fully, but not before his gaze rested on a wooden cross on a far wall. A tight flick moved through his jawline before he smoothed it away. He regarded her with the calm, patient strength that made her heart lean toward him. He'd carried so many burdens for so many people. She had noticed him at the back of the sanctuary 2 Sundays running, hat in his lap, gone before the closing hymn. She had told no one. A man finding his own path back to a pew deserved to walk it unwatched. Grief doesn't keep a schedule, Annie. I learned that slow, he said. In the light filtering through the tall windows, his broad shoulders filled out the thin cotton flannel shirt he wore, while a few strands of hair fell over his forehead. Is that what this is? She asked quietly. Whatever's been sitting on you since the Reyes email? His jaw flexed, the rest of him holding firm against whatever he was wrestling. The chaplain, who had once offered comfort to others, carried his own silence where faith used to live. For half a breath, she thought he might open the door to his feelings. Old business, he paused. I'll handle it before the ceremony. She let it be, recognizing the same instinct she fought in herself, the urge to carry the heaviest things alone, rather than hand them to another person who might drop them. She closed the box, though part of her ached. "Thank you for reading it." She nodded at the card. "I needed somebody to go first." Levi left to return to his ranch soon after, and Annie sat with the box, the old photographs spread across the table. He'd gone still at old business, the same stillness she'd experienced the first year after the funeral, when grief hadn't yet learned how to sit mutely in a room with other people. Chapter 9. The next day, a car Levi didn't recognize sat at the top of his drive when he came back from sorting pears in the calving lot. An older sedan with out-of-state plates and enough pollen haze to say it had traveled further than the county line. The engine ticked as it cooled, and a man leaned against the front fender as though he'd been standing there a while. Silver hair cropped close, weather-darkened face. The shape of his jaw tugged at an old memory. Uncle Cal. Not the whole face, just enough to stop Levi in the middle of the yard. The man's coat was worn thin at the elbows, and he held himself like a man rationing his strength for the conversation rather than the drive. He straightened, favoring one knee. "You'll be Levi, I imagine." No handshake offered. "I'm Zane Holt, your uncle." The name and description came through hard. That might be true, but Levi didn't have room in his life to accept the idea. His fingers clenched the thermometer he forgot he still held. He gave a nod and slipped the thermometer into his pocket. "My uncle mentioned a brother once." "That's about right." "He also made it plain he didn't have one anymore." A breeze stirred. "Fair enough." Zane's mouth twisted. "I guess Cal had his reasons." Levi waited. If the man had come all this way, he could do the talking. "For what it's worth," Zane glanced toward the barn, "I only learned my brother was gone several weeks ago. A county clerk's notice caught up with me." Levi adjusted the cuff of his sleeve. "You expect me to believe that?" "I don't expect much of anything." Zane's words carried no edge, only miles. "I moved around a lot. Montana quit hearing from me about the same time I quit hearing from Montana." A shovel tipped over against the shed wall, clattering sharp. Levi angled his attention past Zane to the pastures climbing toward the foothills. Uncle Cal had taught him every bend of those fences. Which posts leaned after a difficult winter, which stretch drifted shut after the first heavy snow, which calves always slipped beneath the bottom wire before they were old enough to know better. All these acres held fingerprints. "So, what exactly brings you here?" Levi asked. Zane opened the passenger door of his sedan and withdrew a folded packet of thick cream paper, and he said, "I'd hoped we'd sit down." "I'm standing." "My father always intended Sparrow Creek Ranch to belong to both his sons." Levi didn't move. "Cal passed." Zane turned toward the house instead of Levi. "Now I find out everything went to you." "Uncle Cal made his choice." Zane smirked. "Sure looks like that." "You saying he shouldn't have?" "Families don't always leave this world with every promise settled." Zane held out the documents. "Pride kept me distant all those years." Levi's hands stayed at his sides. "My father said Cal and I would split this place one day. Never wrote it down." Zane gave a humorless chuckle. "Back then, men figured a handshake carried farther than ink, but a promise is a promise, however you slice it." "And after all these years you decided to collect?" "I'm running out of time to fix what I broke. I stayed away too long." Zane studied the mountains beyond the calving shed. "Once pride loses its grip, funerals have a habit of coming first." Levi squared the line of his shoulders. "You missed more than a funeral." "Maybe." Zane rested the packet on the hood of the sedan. "But my attorney believes I may have a claim." Wind tugged at Levi's shirt. The barn, the corrals, the meadow stretching gold, past the creek. Every board Uncle Cal had nailed into place, every fence they'd mended shoulder to shoulder. He wrapped his hand around a gatepost until the rough cedar pressed deep into his palm. "You think you're entitled to half?" Zane said. "My father said so." "My uncle owed you nothing." "No." Zane met his eyes. "But if there's even a chance my father intended otherwise." He shrugged a shoulder. "At my age, you stop leaving questions unopened." "Uncle Cal raised me." "Yep." "He taught me to rope." "Comes with owning a ranch." "He sat beside my hospital bed after I got home from overseas." "Kind guy. My brother always was." Each answer chipped away at Levi's anger without easing it. Softly, Levi said, "I buried him." Zane's gaze dropped. "And I wasn't there." The words came so low that the wind nearly stole them. Leather creaked as a gelding shifted by the corral. Levi said low, "My uncle left me this ranch because I was the one who worked this land with him." Levi's voice came out hard, old grief and new anger braiding together. "I didn't take it from anybody. I inherited it from a man who raised me, and you're standing in his driveway telling me I owe you half of it over some verbal promise." "I'm not your enemy, Levi. I'm your uncle." Zane picked up the packet and laid it on the fence rail. "You don't have to read it today." Levi shook his head and said softly, "I may never read it." "That's your choice." Zane opened the driver's door and settled in. "I'll be staying over in Bitterroot at least a week. If you decide you'd rather talk than let lawyers do it for us, you'll find me." The sedan rolled down the drive. Gravel spread, bouncing before lodging in the grass. Levi remained where he was while the packet rested on the fence rail. The breeze worried one corner until it lifted and fell again. A minute ago, the ranch had been the same ranch Uncle Cal had left him. Now, every familiar landmark carried a question, not over a stranger's checkbook, but over blood he'd never really known existed. The week didn't sound like a deadline. It sounded like a man planning to stay until somebody provided Zane with an answer he could live with. With his eyes, Levi measured the sweep of the hayfield. Uncle Cal had lingered there on July evenings, hat pushed back, laughing, because Levi missed an easy throw with the rope. "You'll get another chance tomorrow," he'd said. Tomorrow had always seemed endless. A road outside Kandahar had ended that. Later in the day, Levi gathered the papers in the packet and climbed into his truck. The trip into Bitterroot usually settled him. Today, every mile sharpened what stood to be lost. Farmland whizzed past. The first cutting in a neighbor's yard lay in neat windrows, waiting on the baler. A pair of sandhill cranes lifted from the marsh beside Miller's place, wings beating slow against the blue. Black cattle nosed through the open grass. Here, land passed from one generation to the next. What if Uncle Cal had known this day might come? Had there been another conversation? A promise? A regret he'd carried without speaking the words aloud? As Levi reached town, the courthouse loomed ahead. Main Street bustled with pickups angled along the curb, flower baskets swaying beneath storefront awnings, heavy with petunias and trailing ivy. Teenagers cut across the sidewalk, laughing loud past the ice cream shop, the town's Founders' Day, folded into the 4th of July parade, one long celebration of place and country. Life hadn't changed, only Levi's place in it. Annie raised her head the instant he strode into her office. The smile she'd been wearing faded before he spoke. She came to her feet and rounded the desk. "Levi, what happened? Is anything wrong?" He placed the packet on her desk. "A man showed up at my ranch." "Who? What man?" "He says he's my Uncle Cal's brother." She blinked. Start at the beginning. Your uncle had a brother? Yes, and he wants half the ranch. What's his name? She asked. Zane. Uncle Zane. She seemed to test the name on her tongue. How hard is he pushing? Hard enough. All these years he was never mentioned. Nothing to mention. Levi, listen to me. What does your lawyer say? Lawyer? You're joking, right? I don't have one. Levi pushed the packet of papers to the side of her desk. Mayor Dalton might know somebody in Helena who handles estate disputes, she said. I'll phone him tomorrow. I suppose I can ask Reed Calloway and his wife. Lily is a lawyer. Ask him then. Right. Levi's boots nudged a chair leg. My land has survived droughts, blizzards, and hard winters. Then it can survive one more storm. She grabbed his hand. You're not losing your ranch. Not to an uncle who let decades pass before speaking of a brother. Levi sighed and said, Maybe he's not entirely wrong to want a piece of it, though. Levi's voice came in a slow, even run, more weary than angry. He's an elderly man who lost his brother twice. First to a fight they never mended, then for good, before he had the chance. And he's your uncle. Sounds like it. Levi stared through the office window at the grain silos beyond town. As I drove here, I kept wondering what it must be like spending all those years believing the door's there, then finding out it closed without you. She stepped close enough that her sleeve brushed his forearm. You're the man who stayed. The words sank deep, reminding him whose boots had worn the porch boards thin. Chapter 10. 2 weeks before the 4th of July, Annie unlocked the community office while the town stretched awake. Sunrise slipped through the window, polishing the old pine floor until the knots glowed like amber beneath her boots. The familiar scent of beeswax and stationery that had absorbed more Montana summers than she could count greeted her. Photographs lined the walls in mismatched wooden frames, veterans standing a little straighter as Old Glory passed, toddlers marching with American flags as tall as they were. Her grandfather appeared in more than one photograph, never in the center, always outside the frame's attention, hauling folding chairs, straightening bunting, laughing with someone. For a heartbeat, she stayed put. Then she made for the front window and raised it a crack. A dawn breeze wandered inside, offering the yeasty aroma of fresh bread cooling at the bakery and coffee from the diner. The telephone rang. She glanced toward it, but lifted the sash another inch. The bell rang again. Coming. She stepped toward her desk and reached for the receiver. Bitterroot Community Office. Good morning, Annie. I wanted you to hear it from me before the rumor mill got hold of it. Enthusiasm edged Renee's voice, skillful enough to belong on a campaign poster. Annie's hand stalled on the spiral notebook as she angled into her chair. Renee's careful tone rarely delivered standard news. Hear what? Annie asked. We've confirmed Wade Bishop for our celebration. Annie stared at the stack of parade entry forms on her desk that were blurring together. The radio host? The one and only. Renee laughed. He's broadcasting live from Main Street all afternoon. The regional newspaper is sending a photographer, too. Between that and television coverage, Lone Peak is expecting our biggest turnout in years. Outside, the scrape of a broom traveled through the open window, back and forth, back and forth. I'm happy for you, Annie managed. I knew you would be. A small rustle came through the line. Paper, maybe. I'm sure your celebration will be lovely, Annie replied. Best of luck. Thanks. Best of luck to you, too. Renee's voice softened by a fraction before the line clicked dead. Professional courtesy or professional victory? Annie kept the receiver against her ear a moment longer. She dropped it back into its cradle. Quick enough, the click barely sounded. The room pulled in tight. Not because anything had changed, because everything had. On a far wall, the bulletin board overflowed with handwritten volunteer lists. The church quilting group had agreed to decorate the reviewing stand. The high school band director promised 30 students. Mrs. Wheeler's garden club was nurturing buckets of red geraniums. A strip of kid-made patriotic sheets hung in a loose row, bowed slightly where the tape had loosened. Yesterday, those decorations seemed hopeful. Today, they stood heartbreakingly small, not because they were lacking, because Annie was measuring them against television cameras instead of the people who made them. She pulled the grant spreadsheet closer, and the figures ran together in uneven rows. Advertising, security, portable restrooms. She blinked. The numbers refused to settle into focus. Lone Peak had a celebrity, newspapers, sponsors whose donations probably exceeded Bitterroot's entire budget. A hollow sadness opened beneath her breastbone. Lord, the word barely left her lips. How will we ever compete with that? The air in the office dropped low, the same hush Grandpa Henry used to leave after saying grace before a meal. No one reached for the mashed potatoes right away. He always waited, as though silence made room for God to speak before anyone else did. The memory cleared the knot inside her chest, if only enough to breathe again. Her eyes slid to the photograph on her desk. Henry Whitlock, black and white and army neat, smile unchanged from the one she grew up with. The walnut frame carried a tiny chip near the corner where she'd knocked it from the shelf years ago while tidying. She'd offered to replace it. Grandpa had only smiled and said, "Keeps it honest." His voice came back as clearly as if he stood beside her. "Don't count what you don't have, Annie girl. Count who's standing beside you." The words rose up from a place she hadn't visited in a long while, and she closed her eyes for a heartbeat. Her door opened, and Mayor Dalton stepped inside, balancing 2 paper cups of coffee and a box of cinnamon donuts tucked under his arm. The aroma reached Annie before he did. Buttery pastry, sugar, and dark roast coffee, strong enough to wake half the county. He nudged the door closed with his boot. His straw hat sat low, and a faint dusting of hay clung to his shirt, as though he'd stopped by the office between morning chores instead of after them. "You've developed an unfortunate habit of feeding the rest of Bitterroot before you feed yourself." He set a cup in front of her, then the bakery box. "I bribed Tricia into adding an extra donut." "A baker's dozen. Thanks." Annie attempted a smile. "That must have cost you." "It did." He sighed dramatically. "I had to compliment her pie crust." "There are easier sacrifices." "There are." He pulled up a chair and sat across from her. "Lone Peak landed Wade Bishop," she said. Dalton handed her a coffee. "I heard." "And television." "I heard that too." "And newspaper coverage." "So I understand." Her grip fastened around the cup, the warmth pooling against her palm. "You're taking this awfully well." "I've lived through 47 4th of Julys. And?" "I've seen marching bands caught in hailstorms." He counted on his fingers. Fireworks that wouldn't light. 3 governors who canceled an hour before the parade. A hot air balloon that landed in Mrs. Turner's pumpkin patch. Annie smiled. "You're making those up." "I wouldn't lie about a hot air balloon." "I wish someone had taken pictures." "Oh, there were pictures in the newspaper, all right. Mrs. Turner bought every copy before anyone else could." His grin creased the lines around his eyes. "People remember how a town makes them feel." "So true," she murmured. He gestured toward the street. Folks come because veterans still stand when the anthem begins, because neighbors save chairs for neighbors who haven't arrived yet. She nodded. And because someone they haven't seen since last July remembers their first name. Annie glanced at her coffee. What if believing in Bitterroot isn't enough? Mayor Dalton blew out a breath, and he said, "The commission isn't looking for the loudest celebration. It's looking for a town that believes an American holiday matters after the confetti blows away." Dalton peeled open the bakery box, reached for a donut, and tore off a piece. When your grandfather started the ceremony, he borrowed folding chairs from 3 churches. He once told me he painted parade signs in his garage. Dalton chuckled. Folks still talk about that day. Everyone showed up. He rose and gathered empty napkins and the box of donuts, leaving one for Annie. You've spent your days pulling people together. Don't let a celebrity convince you you've built less than they have. At the doorway, he waited. Oh, and Annie looked up. If Wade Bishop wants cinnamon donuts, he can get them in Lone Peak. He grinned. Our donuts from Trisha's bakery are better. When the door shut behind him, Annie carried her coffee to the front window. Main Street unfolded beneath a sky polished clear by the air. Mrs. Collins balanced on a stepladder, fussing over flower baskets that already looked perfect. Kids flew past the mercantile on their bikes, and someone laughed hard enough to scatter pigeons from the roof. A red pickup rolled slowly down the street, its windows open. A country song by Hank Williams floated behind it. Summer in Bitterroot was a well-worn quilt covering tired shoulders, familiar, dependable, stitched together by people who showed up for one another. She returned to her desk and reached for the parade notebook, volunteer captains, food vendors, parking plans. Her pen hovered over the page. Levi. Without him, the ceremony lost the solemn heart her grandfather had insisted mattered most. People ought to have one chance, he'd said, to remember who paid for the freedom they're celebrating. That moment belonged to the veterans, to the flag, to prayer, and it belonged to Levi. She pictured him standing beneath the enormous American flag in years past, his hat cradled in his hands, shoulders square, eyes fixed on the colors lifting against the Montana sky. When Mayor Dalton introduced him, Levi had stepped to the microphone without hurry. His prayer hadn't been long or polished. He'd thanked God for the men and women who had served and prayed that the town would never take its freedoms for granted. Heads remained bowed for the length of another breath, as though no one wanted to be the first to break the quiet. That peace had become as much a part of Bitterroot's 4th of July as the parade itself. Her fingers rested on her cell phone. She knew Levi's number by heart. Somewhere between planning committee meetings and hurried conversations, she'd memorized it without trying. What if he said no again? His ranch, his uncle, the lawyer, and the occasional look in his eyes, an exhaustion he tried to hide behind a polite smile. He had more pressing burdens than carrying a flag or speaking at a podium. Her thumb hovered over the screen. She set her cell phone down, then picked it up. She laughed softly at herself. I've negotiated with county commissioners. Somehow one cowboy has me completely flustered. Her cheeks warmed. If Mabel heard her, she'd have smiled, the knowing smile only good friends seemed able to master. Outside, the courthouse clock chimed the hour, and Annie drew a slow breath. Fear could sound remarkably sensible. It offered reasons to wait until life became easier, until rejection was less possible. But faith asked people to take the next step before they could see where the path ended. She picked up the phone once more and pressed his name. The line rang. Lord, help me ask again anyway, she whispered. The phone clicked, and she drew a quick breath. "Hello?" Levi's voice, low and familiar, and every carefully rehearsed sentence disappeared. "Hi, Levi. It's Annie. I'm not calling about logistics." A pause on the line, long enough that she heard a gate latch somewhere behind him, metal against metal. "All right." Lone Peak landed a radio host, television, a photographer. She made herself say the rest before courage abandoned her entirely. "I want the ceremony to offer the town what no broadcast can buy, and that means I want you at the podium, Levi. Not only sound equipment, not only chairs. You, speaking as your reputation already promises." "Annie." His voice had gone careful, the same careful she'd heard at the fence post in May. "I told you. I don't know if I'm your man for that." "I know you don't know." She closed her eyes. "I'm asking because I think the not knowing might be exactly why it matters. Does that make sense?" "Let me think on it." Annie hesitated, and then she said, "That's all I wanted. Don't think on it so long it decides itself by default." A slight sound came through the line that might have been the start of a laugh, abandoned halfway. "Have a good rest of your day, Annie." "Sure, Levi. Thanks. You too." She set the phone down, the courthouse clock outside marking another quarter hour. He hadn't said no. He hadn't said yes either. But she'd asked, out loud, with her whole chest, and whatever came out belonged to both, instead of sitting alone in her office, where she pretended she hadn't risked anything at all. Chapter 11. Levi never called. By Monday afternoon, Annie quit setting her phone where she could see it. By Tuesday, she stopped checking whether she'd missed a call while shelving brochures or refilling the coffee pot in the chamber office. "Let me think on it." Those 4 words had sounded like an open gate when he'd spoken them. By Wednesday, they resembled one swinging shut. She refused to push. Growing up in Bitterroot had taught her one lesson. Fences held better when people didn't lean against them. Friday morning arrived, wrapped in a sky so clear that the mountains seemed close enough to touch. Mabel Sawyer hung fresh bunting along Main Street before sunrise, red, white, and blue, rippling above the sidewalks. Cut grass from the courthouse lawn floated in through the office window, mingling with brewed coffee and lemon oil from a century-old pine desk she'd inherited. A Lone Peak broadcast sputtered through the office radio shortly after 8. Annie's spine straightened, as if she'd been called out by name. The phone rang before the closing credits finished. "Chamber of Commerce." "Annie? Reed Calloway." His voice carried the solid confidence of a guy who never wasted words. "I've talked to 3 ranchers. We'll have trucks in the parade, and horses if you want 'em. I'll ask a few veterans if they'll stand with Levi during the ceremony." "I'm not sure if he'll agree yet." Annie stared at the radio dial for a beat before answering. "You don't have to." "We do. No one ought to stand under the flag alone." Before she thanked him, another line flashed. Grace Morrison. Her daughter Anna's happy fussing threading through the background. "I'll take the lemonade booth," Grace said. "You've got enough on your plate." Grace laughed. "So does everyone else." Annie grinned as the call ended. By lunchtime the next day, Tricia announced a cakewalk outside the bakery. The band director called an hour later to add another rehearsal. At 3, several ranch families asked where they should park their stock trailers. Sam Shore, the barber, shuffled through the door with a neatly folded service flag. "My wife's been telling me for years this belongs where folks can see it. I carried this home after Vietnam." His thumb brushed a stitched star. The Chamber of Commerce building thinned out as dusk took hold. Chairs pushed in, and lights snapped off one by one. Outside, a flute played through the national anthem, the notes drifting high and halting every few bars before starting over. A student teacher under Mr. Wilkins, the band director, most likely. She bent over the volunteer roster, adding a name, then another. The paper nearly disappeared beneath her careful handwriting. She eyed her grandfather's framed photograph on her desk. His smile was invariably more interested in other people than in himself. "Communities don't disappear all at once, Annie girl," he'd remarked. "They vanish when one person decides somebody else will do the showing up." Lily Calloway rang last, her voice lower than the rest. She'd spent an evening reading up on verbal promises and out-of-state probate claims, and she told Annie that Levi should know exactly what he was and wasn't up against before Zane's stay ran out. Annie wrote the information down and underlined it twice before the call ended. A shadow crossed the frosted glass in the office door, and she glanced up. Whoever stalled outside didn't knock. The silhouette remained motionless. 1 heartbeat. 2. Then it shifted, as if the person had almost turned away. Her pulse stumbled as the door opened. Levi's hat came off. He held the door until it closed, without a sound. He'd always entered a room as though whoever occupied it deserved respect. How many field hospitals, how many grieving families had watched that same pause before an Army chaplain spoke. "You still open?" he asked as he stepped inside. She smiled. "I was beginning to think I'd have to sleep here." Sweat had dried in pale arcs across his denim shirt, and a smear of grease darkened one cuff. The day had left its mark on him. Beyond the window, a robin finished its last song, pouring a trill into the fading light as though it had no intention of stopping until dark forced it. "I figured." He lifted 2 paper cups. "Dale had the night check at the ranch, and I brought you reinforcements." The aroma wafted over as he approached. Coffee, rich and fresh, and strong enough to wake the courthouse. "You're bribing me," she said. "I've known you since 5th grade, so I can do that." He set 1 cup beside her elbow, turning it so the seam faced away from her lip. Another unconscious habit, making it easy for others. She doubted he even realized he did things like that. His gaze skimmed the volunteer sheet spread across her desk. Names covered nearly every line. Outside, the flute climbed to the final notes of the national anthem. This time, the melody held. "You did all this?" he asked, pulling up a chair. "I made phone calls, and folks called me." She slid the sheet toward him. "Bitterroot did the rest." Levi ran a calloused finger down the page. "Reed, Grace, Walt, Tricia. Ranch families, church members, high school students." His finger stopped. "Everyone." "The mayor and I put out the word that we needed help, and the ball started rolling. Turns out people were waiting for someone to ask." Levi stretched his long legs under the desk. For an instant, she recalled the young man from school, the one who had listened twice as much as he talked. Only now, the lines around his eyes belonged to another lifetime. He hadn't come because of the coffee. He'd come because he'd finally reached an answer. He poked at the end of the list and let the paper rest flat. "I figured folks would volunteer." "But not like this?" He nodded. "I've spent more time than I want to admit convincing myself people had moved on." "They haven't." "No." His gaze skimmed over the names again. "I was the one who did." Wind through the open window stirred the corners of the sign-up sheets. A man laughed as a ladder scraped against brick. Volunteers hung another string of bunting above Main Street, and the fabric snapped. "When I drove in," Levi said, "Mrs. Haskins was making those paper stars with the elementary kids. It's almost dark outside." Annie smiled. "She starts in May." "I used to help her." "You did?" Nearly every 4th of July, you won the bicycle parade in 7th grade. She laughed. I absolutely did not. You told everyone you should have. Because they robbed me of my ribbon. The judges didn't agree. She blew out a breath. They gave first place to Tommy Briggs because his parents covered his bike with 27 pinwheels. Quietly, he said, I counted 30. She blinked. You counted? Yup. His shoulders lifted. And I mentioned to Stella Calloway that she can't carry a flag taller than she is. She's currently negotiating for a smaller one and has several counteroffers prepared. A laugh slipped out before Annie could stop it. She'll win. He smiled. She always wins. How rarely she'd seen him smile since he'd come home. The years hadn't stolen his sense of humor, only buried it. I've missed this town, he murmured, gazing toward the window. Main Street had gone soft and gold in the evening's last light, the flags above the hardware store lifting and falling in a lazy breath of wind. This was a town worth defending. Levi removed his work gloves from his back pocket and laid them beside his hat. He smoothed a finger across the worn leather. Another habit of his. Everything had its place. He tossed nothing aside. Her grandfather said you could judge a person's character by how they handled ordinary things. Levi handled ordinary things like they mattered. So, he leaned back in the chair. I suppose you have questions. Her pulse beat fast in her throat. I might. You've been practicing. She smiled. Maybe. I've practiced my answer. Her shoulders tipped forward. Oh? Levi said in a soft, low voice. It kept changing. She folded her shaking hands before they betrayed her. I wouldn't ambush you. He studied the courthouse through the window. The flagpole was empty tonight, waiting for Independence Day. He spoke after nearly a minute. I drove out to the cemetery yesterday. Her breath hitched. Your Uncle Cal? There were fresh flowers. He swallowed the lump in his throat. I don't know who left them by a marker. Then I stood there trying to remember what I said at Danny's funeral. She waited, not speaking. When I did, his voice roughened. I wished I hadn't. She didn't interrupt. Levi deserved room to finish. I quoted the 23rd Psalm. His gaze fixed beyond the window. I could have recited it in my sleep. His tone lowered another notch. But standing there in front of the grieving soldiers, my words turned to sand. Her chest folded in on itself. She recognized loss and applauded the courage to admit the hurt aloud. When I came home, he peered down at his hands. Everyone in town kept calling me chaplain. They meant well. You deserved it. Did I? Whenever they said it, he shook his head. The word belonged to a stranger. From the street, the flute began again. The student teacher stumbled through America the Beautiful, missing nearly every high note. Levi rested both forearms on his knees. I prayed beside hospital beds. I knew what to say when helicopters landed and how to write letters to families. I prayed with 19-year-old soldiers who were afraid they weren't going home. He drew a careful breath. But after Danny, I couldn't pray for myself. He stepped to the window. Moonlight rested over the mountains, leaving the valley washed in amber and blue. Cottonwood leaves turned their pale undersides to the gusts of wind, showing white with every gust. She rose without thinking. The pine floor gave a familiar groan as she stopped beside him. His reflection shimmered in the glass, broad-shouldered. A person could depend on a guy like that to hold a fence line against a storm. You know who I see? She questioned. A teenager who sat alongside Mrs. Ellison after her husband died. Levi's brow furrowed. You were 16 and you skipped football practice. You stayed with her because she didn't want to eat alone. He pressed a finger on the window frame. I'd forgotten. You've always walked toward people who were hurting. You think that makes me qualified? No. She stepped closer. It tells me who you are. A gust lifted a strand of hair across her cheek. Before she tucked it back, Levi's hand moved toward her, then stopped inches away. His fingers curled, and he let his hand fall. I'm trying to recall that man, he said. Annie's voice softened. He never left. I wonder whether standing up there will make me a hypocrite. I don't. He turned slightly. You don't? Pretending you never struggled would make you a hypocrite. Levi said softly, That sounds like your grandfather. He'd probably tack on 3 more stories and a slice of apple pie. He fingered the film on the sill. Would you mind if I worked this out how I used to? Her next breath came in a beat late. You mean? He nodded. With a prayer. Please. He folded his hands loosely in front of him, his eyes closed. Father, I've started this conversation often over the last year. I wasn't sure you wanted to hear much from me. His voice stayed low. I believed I failed a young man who deserved better. I decided you must be disappointed in me. But a town gathered around one another. He smiled ever so slightly. And maybe that's been your answer all along. If there's still work for me, help me stop looking backward long enough to see it. If there's a place for a chaplain who isn't certain of much anymore, his eyes remained closed. I'll go. Almost as an afterthought, he added, Thank you. His smile deepened. For stubborn women who never quit. Annie grinned and whispered, Amen. She walked back to the sheet lying open on the desktop and picked up her pencil. So. He came beside her. So, I'll do it. His answer was weather-worn, like a hinge that hadn't turned in years. Thank you, Levi. I'll write your name by the invocation. She tapped the pencil against the margin. You'll say a few words? You'll stand at the podium? His mouth moved toward another smile he was clearly trying to ration. You can stop pretending it isn't already there. She peered at the sheet. His name, written several days earlier in her own careful handwriting, 2 lines from the top. She dropped the pencil and covered her face with her hands. Oh, right. I noticed. You weren't supposed to. I was sitting right here. He laughed, a real one that reached his blue eyes, and stayed there. She wished she could bottle the sound and save it for a cold February night. I suppose I was looking ahead and being optimistic, she said. I'd call it faith. Their gazes met. He picked up his hat and set it on his head. Then he took her hand and laced his fingers through hers, his thumb tracing her knuckles before he let go. I'll see you on the 4th. It's a deal? Deal. He strode to the door. His shoulders filled the doorframe. He turned. Annie? Yes? Thank you for reminding me that God never stopped believing in me. He closed the door softly behind him. She studied the volunteer sheet and circled his name. The coffee had gone lukewarm. She lifted the cup anyway and brought it to the window. Wind moved through town, bringing the sweetness of Tricia's last bake of the evening. Further off, the band assembled and ran through a familiar Sousa march, a little ragged, entirely earnest, and exactly right. She smiled before she fully realized why. A new morning would bring questions. The ranch, Zane, the grant. None had disappeared. But tonight, one burden had. Levi? She breathed. She didn't need faith to envision him positioned beneath the flag. She could practically hear his voice offering a prayer over Bitterroot, over the families assembled there, over those who had served and those who carried invisible battles home. The future no longer seemed to slip through her fingers, anticipating the next rise. perhaps they'd walk toward a future together. Chapter 12. Walt Hargrove lived in a cabin 5 miles outside town, with a porch wide enough for a couple of rocking chairs and a view that stopped most visitors mid-sentence the first time they saw it. Levi had been driving out every few weeks since his uncle's funeral, though neither man called it counseling. Both preferred to let it pass as two old soldiers talking weather and cattle prices. Tonight, the surroundings breathed wood smoke, coffee that had simmered too long on the stove, and the resinous bite of sun-warmed pine stacked under the rail. A breeze lifted the American flag hanging from the porch. Walt's herding dog thumped her tail against the boards, gray muzzle resting on her paws before she went back to sleep. Down in the draw, a heifer threw a low call into the brush. Walt poured 2 cups of coffee and skipped the weather. He reached for the modest pile of kindling alongside the rocker and split a thicker piece with his knee before feeding it into the porch stove. The raw wood released a keen, clean scent as the fire answered with a rush of sparks. "Levi, you've stirred that coffee 3 times without taking a drink." Walt sank into his chair, which complained along the length of its runners. "Seen it on plenty of men. Seen it in the mirror, too. More years than I'd like to admit. Carol and Marcus Reyes are flying to Bitterroot." Levi eased the rocker back a half inch. "Danny's mother and father." He sighed. "Yep. All for a dedication I started. I had no idea it would grow this big. Her letter's been writing in my shirt pocket for days." Levi slipped the folded envelope halfway out of his pocket, then back in. "I assured Annie I'd participate at the ceremony, and I meant it when I said it. Now I can't stop wondering if I committed to more than I'm able to keep." He placed his cup on the porch rail. "And my uncle's brother showed up at my gate with a lawyer's letter, claiming half the ranch on a promise nobody but him can recall. 34 years of silence, and Uncle Zane's ready to talk inheritance. A ranch I've spent years building is up for argument by somebody who wasn't there to earn it." "That bothering you for the size of it, or for who's asking?" "Both. Neither." Levi shook his head. "Don't know." "The ranch fight isn't yours to swing at," Walt replied. "That one belongs to lawyers. You hire a good one and go back to fixing fences." Levi sighed. "It's my land," he said. "It's your land whether or not you lose sleep over it. Losing sleep won't move the property line 1 inch." Walt scraped a boot heel across the boards. "Can't fight every battle at once, son. Pick the ones that are actually yours." Levi grunted. Handing off any fight sat wrong with him, the same as handing off a sick calf or a stretch of downed wire. But he filed the advice where he could find it again. "Pastor Michael mentioned you slipping out before the closing hymn every Sunday, by the by." "At least I started to attend church again." "Yep." Walt rolled the cup in his hands. "He doesn't speak a word about it except to me. Notices, though." "I didn't realize anyone checked that." "This community clocks more than you think. Most have the sense not to say so." Walt took a measured drink, the delay doing the talking. "You've also checked the road toward town twice since you sat down." "Have I?" Levi didn't bother to dress the words up. And I hear the Calloway girl is negotiating flag sizes for the parade. Word at the feed store is she drives a hard bargain." "Stella wanted a flag taller than the mayor. She'll probably settle for one that clears her head and call it fair." "Smart girl. Reed and Lily are raising a kid that's hard to keep up with." Walt's amusement thinned out, the porch taking back its quiet. "You ever mention Danny Reyes to anyone?" "Not the report. The part that's yours." The dog flopped onto one side with a sigh that seemed louder than either man. "I did talk to Annie. Some of it." "More than you've given me? She's getting further in than I have. and I've been working at you a year and a half." She didn't ask me to be anything I wasn't trying to be. She waited there, patient, and allowed me to come to it on my own time. "Sounds like a woman worth more than a flag ceremony and a parade route, son. You planning to let this one get past you like the seminary gal did? You were nearly engaged by graduation." "Claire." Levi turned the cup once. Then I signed the Army paperwork, and she wanted a parsonage with a garden in Denver, not a duffel bag and 2 continents. Can't fault her for it. She married a youth pastor in Ohio and sends a Christmas card. "And Annie?" "Annie." He turned the cup again. "She's one of the best." "Tell me the rest, then." Walt's voice gentled. "The part you haven't told her." Levi took in the valley. A nighthawk split the air with a piercing cry. Evening pushed a cool breath up from the lower field, hay rising sweet and green. Meadowlarks, rain, cottonwood, each had been pressed at Levi for weeks, beauty showing up and refusing to give him room. "I prayed over the convoy the morning it left." He closed his eyes. For an instant, he wasn't on Walt's porch. He was standing beside a line of dust-coated Humvees while young men adjusted helmets and traded jokes they didn't finish, waiting for him to pray. Danny grinned before bowing his head, so youthful, dirt on his boots. A letter from home folded inside his vest. "I told them I'd ask the Lord for safe travel over the whole route. Told them like I was reading it off a delivery schedule." Levi pulled off his hat and laid it brim down. "We were halfway back when the blast took Danny's vehicle. I was 3 trucks behind him. I ran to him. I got there in time to—" He stopped. The words locked in his throat and refused the jump. They'd grown into the shape of his own ribs, and yanking them out here on a porch would be yanking out the frame of the house. Walt set his cup against his knee and let the crickets hold the floor. "Ever since," Levi managed at last, "I've wondered if every word I prayed that morning blew away before it reached heaven. A man who prayed that wrong doesn't get to stand up and tell anybody else how to have faith." "Who told you that's how it works?" Walt's question hit like a gate chain, snapping against a post. "Who told you grace runs out when it doesn't turn out how you wanted?" Levi took the top step and shook Walt's hand. "You always this free with advice?" "Only with men too stubborn to ask for it." The dog lifted its head as Levi passed. "Drive safe, chaplain." The title followed Levi down the steps, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't land like an accusation. It landed like a name being handed back. He was home by full dark. The first test shell for the fireworks went up from the fairgrounds while he was still halfway between the truck and the porch. Involuntarily, his body answered before his mind could vote. He sank low, turning for cover, pulse slamming, one hand reaching for a rifle he had not carried in months. Then the firework rolled over the valley and unraveled into echo. Harmless. A bloom of gold hung over the far tree line, and he stood in his own yard, feeling like a fool in front of nobody but the dark. He made himself breathe, made himself watch the gold fade to smoke. Danny had gone on and on about loving fireworks. That was the part Levi could never square. Half the men he served with flinched at fireworks for the rest of their lives, and Danny Reyes had loved them like a boy, had once talked an entire forward operating base into homesick silence, describing the 4th of July in his mother's backyard, the blanket dragged out to the grass, the smell of her roses, the 2-hour wait for the first shell. "Chaplain," Danny had said, grinning in the dark, "you can keep Christmas. Give me a loud sky and my mom's potato salad, and I am a rich man." A second shell broke the night open. Levi flinched again, less this time, and held his ground. Come the 4th. 3 days off now, The sky over Bitterroot would do this for 22 straight minutes, and the entire town would tip their faces up to it. And he could either be a man hiding in a barn or a man standing in a field, remembering a kid who loved a loud sky. He didn't know which man he would be, but the gold came again over the trees, and he watched it the whole length of its falling. It cost him, but he stayed. Chapter 13. The night before the 4th of July celebration, Bitterroot held its breath. Annie stayed at the chamber office long past closing, the sponsor ledger open beneath the desk lamp. The spreadsheet columns had swum together an hour earlier. Through the window, Main Street lay poised like a stage. Bunting rippled from lamppost to lamppost. Folding tables stood sentinel in front of Trish's bakery, and Grace's lemonade coolers waited under a tarp on the courthouse lawn. One of Reed's stock trailers gleamed at the block's end, washed until its metal flashed in the moonlight. The flagpole rope clicked against the pole in the breeze, keeping time for a town that had turned in early so it could rise renewed. The knock came at Annie's glass door a few minutes past 9, firm yet hesitant, as though the visitor weighed the cost of stepping through the threshold. His silhouette shifted before her fingers touched the knob. His hat came off at the threshold. The brief hesitation he gave every doorway. A gentleman's courtesy convinced that rooms belonged first to those already inside them. "The office closed 2 hours ago," she said, swinging the door open. "I'm aware." He stepped inside and let the entryway absorb him without a sound. Fatigue etched faint lines at the corners of his eyes. Beneath the fatigue lay the stillness of a hayfield the morning after a storm had passed. Not the guarded armor he'd brought home from overseas. This was gentler. "I owe you the rest of the story," he said. "All right." She dragged a second chair around to her side of the desk. The lamplight threw a small circle of light, leaving a portion of the office in shadow. He dropped his forearms onto his knees, the wooden chair creaking under the shift. His worn denim shirt pulled tight over muscles honed by years of duty. "I've rehearsed this 100 times. He exhaled. "If I stopped talking," he began and didn't finish. "Go ahead. I'll wait." "Danny Reyes was 22. Levi gave a single dip of his head. "He was always hungry, always teasing someone. He kept Hubba Bubba gum in his cargo pocket, claiming army food needed divine intervention to be palatable." A breath escaped Annie before she realized she'd smiled. "Yeah? He made people do that." Levi's smile disappeared as quickly as it came. "We were running convoy outside Kandahar. I prayed before we rolled out." Silence gathered, the air thickening. "I asked the Lord to bring every one of us home. Halfway back, the blast hit Danny's vehicle. I ran before the dust even settled." Levi's voice lowered to a husky murmur. "I kept praying while I ran. Please, Lord, please." He swallowed. "And then?" "I reached him. I held his hand. He looked at me like he expected me to fix it." Levi's eyes finally lifted to Annie. "I couldn't." His thumb scraped the brim of his hat. "He knew he was dying. He asked me if he was going to see Jesus." She drew a sharp, silent inhale. "I told him yes." Levi stared at the floor between his boots. "Then he asked me to tell his parents he wasn't afraid." Those were the last words he ever spoke. The office emptied of sound, broken only by the buzz of the desk lamp. "I wrote Carol and Marcus Reyes afterward. Then I rewrote the letter." Levi rubbed his bottom lip. "Then I rewrote it again. Nothing sounded big enough for parents who'd buried their son." Annie waited. "When I came home, people thanked me for my service. They called me a hero. All I could think was I couldn't keep a promise I'd made before that convoy ever left." "You are a hero," she whispered. Am I? I've wondered every day whether God heard me or whether he said no. Levi gave a weary shake of his head. And if he said no? Why did I spend a year and a half acting like he owed me an explanation? Annie slipped her hand over his. Levi. He closed his fingers around hers. Every time someone asked me to pray after I came home, part of me wondered why they'd ask the man whose prayer hadn't been enough. Annie's grip tightened. That's not who you are. Isn't it? No, you crouched beside a frightened young soldier when his family couldn't. You reminded him he wasn't alone. She squeezed his hand. That wasn't failing him. Levi's eyes closed for a long moment. When they opened again, some of the strain had unwound from his expression. Maybe, his voice trailed. He reached into his shirt pocket and drew out an envelope, its paper softened by 9 days of carrying. Carol Reyes, he said. Read it, please. The handwriting flowed in painstaking loops, a mother's hand shaped by grief and grace. Carol and her husband were not coming to Montana for judgment. They were coming because their son's letters home had brimmed with a chaplain who laughed at their son's terrible jokes, knew her garden by name, and made a scared boy feel God sat close, even in the roar of battle. They wanted to shake that man's hand. They wanted to hear him speak. Annie folded the letter and placed it on the brim of his hat. They aren't coming to put you on trial, Levi. Walt used words like that. His mouth bent toward a smile. You two ought to compare notes. Between the pair of you and a little girl negotiating flag sizes, I don't stand a chance. Did Stella win the negotiation? What do you think? She'll carry a flag precisely 1 inch shorter than she is, and she has the measurement in writing. The humor gentled out of him, leaving raw openness. I phoned Lily Calloway again this afternoon about Uncle Zane. Walt says the ranch fight belongs to lawyers, and mine belongs elsewhere. He tapped the envelope. Tomorrow I'm doing all of it. The parade, the flag, and the bench ceremony. I should have agreed the first day you showed up at my fence. She went to her desk drawer and pressed her grandfather's index card into his palm. In case your words run out, borrow his. Everybody else wanted the chaplain back, Levi said. You keep talking to the rancher. They were close, closer than they'd ever allowed themselves. His thumb brushed her knuckles, and her fingers curled around his. Annie Whitlock. He stared at her for so long, her pulse jumped in her throat. I kept telling myself I'd stop craning my neck to watch for your truck. She smiled. You noticed my truck? He said. I noticed when it wasn't there. I'd finish feeding the horses and wonder whether you'd stop by. If it wasn't in my driveway, the place was empty. You never said, she told him. I was afraid if I did, you wouldn't come again. Air stalled in her throat. Good thing I never gave up on committee business. Committee business? That was my official reason for driving out there. And here, I thought you were interested in my clipboard. He said, Oh, it wasn't the clipboard. His free hand rose to her face. Wire and weather had roughened his palm. It was the woman holding it. I can't remember what I thought this valley was missing before you trespassed in my pasture. She lifted a brow. Trespassing. He studied her face as if committing it to memory. I'm hoping you'll do it again. He drew her close and kissed her, a feather-light graze that deepened by degrees, asking permission without words. His cedar soap clung beneath the clean scent of cotton. She answered by sliding her hand to his shoulder and rubbing the light scruff on his jaw. The well-loved fabric under her fingertips held the deep, living heat of him. His heart beat solid and unwavering, grounding her as the room narrowed around them. They parted, and he rested his forehead on hers. Well, that was overdue. He laughed under his breath. I've wanted to do that since you came to my fence and aimed that clipboard at me like a warrant. Don't blame my clipboard again. You were impossible. I was scared. She absorbed his response without flinching. I understand, she said quietly. His second kiss was briefer, bolder. He cupped her nape, lifting her, his fingers tangling in the strands. When her feet met the floor, she pressed her palms to his chest. You want to know when I knew? Knew what? If I have to explain, I'm stopping. Don't stop. Tell me. She tapped a pearl snap button on his shirt, a small, intimate claim. The night you brought coffee to this office, you set my cup down and turned it, so the seam faced away from my lip. No one has ever taken care of me without making sure I noticed. I drove home and told my reflection I was in serious trouble. The seam. He shook his head, a soft huff of laughter. 14 years of sermons and a paper cup won you over. The cup was the evidence. The man was the argument. He dropped quiet, and when he spoke again, the humor had folded away, replaced by an exposed asking in his expression. Sit near the front tomorrow, beside Carol and her husband. When I stand at that podium, yours is the first face I want to find. You'll find it. She would have promised the moon if he'd asked in that voice. I'll be the woman with the clipboard. He laughed. At the corner of the courthouse lawn near the Veterans Garden, canvas billowed over the hidden shape of a bench no one had seen yet. His gaze stayed there a long moment. Danny would have liked this town, he said. He'd have run Grace's lemonade stand out of business by noon and charmed Tricia out of free cinnamon donuts by 2. Then we'll make sure his parents go home, realizing his name lives here in the hearts that refuse to forget. She fitted her cheek against his chest. His heartbeat quickened. Tomorrow's a long day, she murmured. Tomorrow's a good one. His arms drew close, his answer stirring the hair at her temple. I believe that more than I've believed anything in a long while. A few minutes later, he reached for his hat, then stopped, his fingers brushing the back of hers, as if touching her had become the most natural thing he'd done all day. He smiled, then picked up the hat. Beyond the window, Main Street waited under its bunting, ready for morning. A lone vehicle faded, and a distant door clapped shut. Inside the office, neither of them moved. Chapter 14. The 4th of July arrived without a cloud in the sky. By 7, the sun had already burned the dew off the storefront awnings, and the air held that particular Montana promise of a day that would climb into the 90s by noon. Gusts laced with the scent of river willow, cool enough at its boundaries to remind the valley that the mountains kept their snow no matter what July believed. By 8:30, Main Street had traded its usual unhurried pace for the restless energy of a ranch before branding. Car doors slammed. Volunteers threaded extension cords under borrowed church tables. Every opening of the bakery door released a quick, sweet heat that met the street's coffee steam and the sun-baked leather from the horses waiting ahead. Annie climbed the chamber office steps with her clipboard tucked beneath her arm. After a million hours of phone calls, committee meetings, weather forecasts, revised schedules, and crossed-out lists, the day slipped beyond planning. It belonged to the town now, resplendent and festive. She glanced at the clipboard. Every box wore a neat check mark. For the first time since March, she slid the pencil behind her ear instead of gripping it. She'd chosen a red sundress for the occasion, the one she'd bought 2 summers ago and never had a reason to wear, and braided her hair over her shoulders against the heat. A dusting of freckles had surfaced across her nose from standing in parking lots ordering the festival into place, and she'd given up on covering them. Grandpa Henry used to say freckles were proof a woman worked outdoors where the living was. Today, she believed him. A burst of brass music spilled around the corner. The parade had started with a Sousa march, the Stars and Stripes Forever, rising to a crescendo. Mr. Wilkins appeared first, striding backward in polished loafers with the confidence of a man who trusted 30 teenagers not to run him over. His arms sliced clean patterns through the air, and the high school band answered every cue. Trumpets rang clear with a brisk tempo. Snare drums snapped beneath them with crisp precision. Annie grinned. Only a few weeks ago, those same students had stumbled through the march one uneven measure at a time. Now, not a note lost the tempo. Freshly washed Fords and Chevys idled down Main Street, each delivering youngsters whose excitement had long since outgrown any promise to remain seated. Tiny flags whipped above their heads. One little boy waved so enthusiastically that his cap tumbled into the street, earning delighted laughter from both sidewalks before his grandfather scooped it up without missing a step. Horse trailers that hauled livestock every other Saturday of the year dripped with bunting. Flatbeds vanished beneath hand-painted scenery. Some ambitious soul had recreated the Bitterroot range in poster paint, complete with a cotton ball snow line. Even the tractors wore ribbons looped around their mirrors, and one had an American flag zip tied to its exhaust stack. Seasons of borrowed ladders, donated lumber, and neighbors disagreeing over paint colors, parade order, and most matters in between had somehow become this. Then came the riders. The first clop of iron on pavement ran down Main Street ahead of them, and the sidewalks hushed. Phones sank forgotten into pockets. Along the curb, a row of small heads leaned out over the gutter, one boy up on his toes, as though the extra inch might bring the horses sooner. Levi Holt rode at the front. He sat deep in the saddle on a bay gelding, his hands resting light on the reins, asking rather than telling. His uncle's sweat-stained hat shaded his face, a hat the older folks along the sidewalk would have recognized before they recognized the man beneath it. He wore a pressed white shirt, sleeves buttoned at the wrist, despite the climbing temperature. Army habits died slower than the heat could kill them. The sun had bronzed him over the seasons of ranch work until his forearms matched the leather of his saddle. Brown hair brushed his collar, still overdue for a cut. He was a tall man, made taller by horseback, and the blue gaze under the hat brim swept the crowd without hurry, the habit of a chaplain counting his flock, or a soldier clearing a street. Perhaps both. Nothing about him asked for attention. Somehow, he drew every eye anyway. 3 veterans walked beside him. Sam Shore kept pace on Levi's right, his service flag folded neatly beneath one arm. The oldest veteran leaned on a polished walnut cane, but refused all offers of assistance. Pride straightened the shoulders that age no longer could. Annie's throat pinched. It wasn't because the parade had begun on time, or because every float had shown up, or because the commission representative was milling in the crowd with her leather notebook. It was because Levi had said yes. Without him, the morning would still have happened. The band would have played. Small hands would have waved their flags. But the heart of it would have been missing. A small little girl's voice pierced the applause. "Mr. Holt!" she cried out. Stella Calloway bounced on the curb between Reed and Lily, her hard-won flag planted in one fist, precisely 1 inch shorter than she was, while she stretched a poster above her head with the other hand. The crayon letters slanted in every direction. "Thank you, Mr. Holt." The stars surrounding the words had turned purple where red and blue crayons had met. Levi grinned. Instead of lifting a hand, he angled his horse toward the edge of the street, so Stella understood he'd come especially for her. He bent in the saddle long enough to read every crooked letter before tapping 2 fingers against his heart. Stella spun to the strangers beside her. "I negotiated with him." A grandmother 2 chairs down laughed hardest of all. Levi straightened. Then, as naturally as breathing, his attention strayed toward the chamber steps, as though, in the back of his mind, he'd known exactly where Annie would be standing. He held her gaze a beat longer than a parade required. 2 beats. The clipboard shifted in Annie's grasp. The metal clip pressed into her palm hard enough to leave its imprint before she loosened her fingers. She ought to wave. Instead, the corners of her mouth answered him before her hand ever did. A woman beside the steps followed his line of sight, then gave Annie a grin that said all the locals would know by noon. The whole town probably knew by 11. As the final float disappeared around the corner, Main Street no longer belonged to the parade. It belonged to conversations that refused to end. Neighbors clustered beneath storefront awnings. Along the curb, candy negotiations broke out in every direction. 2 suckers for a full-sized Hershey being the going rate. Lawn chairs snapped shut, and the crowd loosened toward the church grounds, unhurried as a congregation empties after the last hymn. Mabel's pie booth already had customers waiting 3 deep. She accepted payment with one hand and local news with the other, dispensing generous portions of both before sending each customer on their way. Cherry disappeared first. Peach wasn't far behind. Cole trotted past with several riders from the Double H, Grace on foot leading hers. Little Anna snuggled on Grace's chest beneath a tiny pink sun hat that threatened to slide over her eyes. Grace nudged it back without interrupting her conversation. Cole lifted 2 fingers from the reins toward Levi, and he answered with the slightest nod. The exchange lasted scarcely longer than a blink. Respect rarely needed more than that. Levi's attention shifted. His shoulders gathered, the change so slight anyone else might have missed it, but Annie had spent many weeks learning him. This wasn't tension. This was a man deciding in advance what he would allow himself to feel. She followed his gaze to a man under the shelter of a broad canvas awning, half in shadow, a folded lawn chair held close. He didn't wave. Neither did Levi, though the ease went out of him at the sight, and Annie understood she was watching family. He must be Zane, Levi's uncle. Neither man tried to shorten the stretch of pavement separating them. Levi's route was fixed. The parade owned him for another 1/4 mile, and Zane had planted his lawn chair where he meant to keep it. A nod passed between them, brief as a tipped hat brim, and then the bay gelding bore Levi on down Main Street. They didn't need another conversation anyhow. The important one had already taken place beside Levi's driveway. The veterans passed, medals throwing sparks of morning sun. The riders followed. A Tootsie Roll skittered into the gutter, and 3 kids dove for it at once. The final float labored by beneath the quilting club's banner, 8 feet of stitched history, wagon wheels and wheat sheaves, and a calico version of Main Street itself, every square sewn by hands that had buried husbands and raised barns, and seen most of those years personally. Zane removed his hat. He held it against his chest until the last veteran had gone by, honoring men he'd never learned to talk to. Cal's brother sat alone under an awning. The church lawn scarcely resembled grass anymore. Patchwork quilts overlapped, edges held down with whatever folks had. Thermoses, a stray book, a coiled lead rope. Card tables and sawhorse planks sagged under tuna noodle and green bean casseroles, potato salads, sliced tomatoes, biscuits, fried chicken, and enough sumptuous desserts to feed half the county twice over. Wood smoke from Harold's barbecue pit tangled with the vanilla sweetness of pastries. George Strait's Check Yes or No sang from a pickup parked beneath the trees, a song about a love that started in a schoolyard, which felt right for a town where half the couples on those quilts had known each other since third grade. Near the dessert table, two women conducted an animated discussion over whose ambrosia salad had earned first place last year, while their husbands sampled both and wisely declined to announce a winner. Pastor Michael climbed onto a folding chair, raised both arms for attention, and got most of it. Before we eat, we give thanks. His hand shaded his eyes as he searched the grassy area. Levi, will you do us the honor? Levi stayed at the edge of the shade near the food tables, boots in the grass, a pie server in one hand, from helping Mabel before she disappeared for another load. He set the server down and nodded. He didn't walk to the front. He stayed where he was, the lawn muffled by degrees, the last of it a boy in a clip-on tie, shushed mid-giggle by three mothers at once, only one of them his own. Levi's breath rose slow, the same breath he'd taken when he'd agreed to ride. He removed his hat and clasped his hands. Lord, bless this food and the folks who made it. Thank you for a town that shows up. He bowed his head. Thank you for the men and women who brought us this day. Keep us worthy of your grace. Amen. The amens made their rounds among the quilts, passed hand to hand along with the fried chicken. He placed his hat on his head, his hand wavering on the brim. 4 sentences. His first prayer spoken over a gathering since Afghanistan, and he'd made it sound as effortless as breathing. Annie knew better. That was the miracle. Soon after, he appeared beside her, a paper plate in each hand. Pulled pork and baked beans crowded one plate, the other stacked with cornbread, slaw, and fried chicken. I intercepted these before Harold decided barbecue counted as a vegetable. Levi offered her the fuller plate without inspecting first. She accepted. I was wondering whether I'd eat today. You would have remembered eventually. Optimistic of you. Dale radioed. A dry note entered his voice. Oh? Do you need to get back to your ranch? Hardly. He said the cows are behaving better than the county. She laughed. And? He told me not to hurry home. He trusts wires more than people. The rancher in him is talking. He lowered onto a quilt beside her. Plenty of space remained on every side, yet he chose the narrow strip nearest her. Their sleeves touched when he settled his plate across one knee. He smelled of saddle leather and starch and the distinct sweetness of hay, and Annie discovered that a woman could lose track of a perfectly good plate of fried chicken over such a discovery. For several minutes, they ate without speaking, shoulder to shoulder on the quilt, close enough that her sleeve brushed his with every forkful. Neither moved apart. Kids chased one another between the blankets. A voice called for more lemonade, and the afternoon folded around the two of them, busy enough to hide in, warm enough to stay. A toddler raced toward the horses before 4 adults intercepted him amid enthusiastic applause from everyone who hadn't been chasing him. Levi smiled as the rescue unfolded. I think that little fellow has rodeo plans. Or his mother soon will. He chuckled. Weeks ago, his every smile seemed borrowed from another lifetime. Here they appeared without effort, as though the months of hauling had finally slackened their load. So, I've heard at least 6 people thank you today, Annie, Levi said. They're thanking everyone, not only me. Nope, they're thanking you most of all. She ran her thumbnail along the fluted rim of her paper plate. It took half the county and then some. It usually does. He went back to pushing the beans around, then turned to her. Most folks see a parade. You envisioned it before anyone else. You're a smart, creative woman. I couldn't have done it without you. It took all of us. Afterward, a glowing Vivian Cruz flagged Annie down near the lemonade stand. The commission's observer was a soft-spoken lady past 60 in sensible shoes and a wilted linen blazer, hair pinned into a bun that had surrendered a strand over each ear. She'd spent the day jotting notes in a leather folio, reading glasses pushed up into her hair, a smear of huckleberry pie sugar on one cuff that she either hadn't noticed or had decided to keep. She was still writing when she reached Annie. 11 celebrations this summer, Vivian said, clicking her pen closed. I've seen bigger stages and louder sound systems. She gestured at the lawn, where Sam Shore was teaching 2 teenagers the correct fold of a flag while their parents filmed it. I haven't seen this. Whatever this is, Miss Whitlock, it doesn't rent by the hour. Thank you. It took 250 years to set up, Annie replied. Vivian laughed, a short, surprised note. Don't forget to put that in your grant narrative. She moved off toward the bake sale, folio open again. Annie held her ground a moment longer, a fast knock working inside her chest. Not yet. She wouldn't celebrate until the scores came in. However, she breathed easier than she had in a long while and went to find Levi, because the day still offered a meeting more crucial than all the others. Carol and Marcus Reyes arrived an hour before the dedication. The town would gather at 5, chairs from 3 different fellowship halls standing in meticulous rows beside the memorial, none of them matching, a microphone waiting. Annie had it all on her clipboard, timed to the minute. Sound check at 4:15. Programs on chairs by 4:30. Fireworks crew confirmed at the fairgrounds by 6, though the sky would not give them full dark until well past 9. Her plan was simple. Walk the Reyes family to the garden, then slip back to the square where 100 small fires needed putting out. Levi had asked for this hour first. Family only. No podium, no program, no audience. Annie knew them the moment their rental car door opened, though she'd never seen a photograph. Carol was petite, her silver hair pinned in the same style she'd likely worn for 30 years, and she wore a turquoise dress with a deep red rose fastened at the shoulder, a Mr. Lincoln. She bore the studied poise of a woman who had practiced this day in the mirror. Marcus was short and spare, gone gray at the temples, with a farmer's permanent tan ending at his shirt collar and pronounced marionette lines on either side of his mouth. His hand rested at his wife's back as though he'd kept it there for 40 years. Annie escorted them to a garden behind the Veterans Memorial, modest by design. Peonies from somebody's grandmother's stock bloomed against the fence line. A coffee can of cigarette butts by the gate told of vigils nobody discussed, and the grass wore a path from the sidewalk to the maple tree. Slowly, Carol unveiled the canvas. The bench beneath the maple tree was plain wood, sanded and oiled by hand. Sunlight through the leaves sifted across the brass plaque fixed to the back rail. Danny's name, his rank, his dates, 22 years bracketed in metal. Beneath, the line of scripture from Joshua 1:9 that Levi had chosen. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Annie meant to leave then. Her hand grabbed the gate latch. This hour belonged to a family she'd never met and a man she had come to know too well. But Levi stood apart, and her feet refused the order to go. Carol read the words aloud. Then she and her husband sat on their son's bench, her hand on the rail like it might answer back. He memorized that verse in 4th grade, she murmured, for a Sunday school prize, which was a pencil box. Her thumb went letter by letter over the carvings, seemingly unwilling to reach the edge. He kept that pencil box through basic training, I discovered it in his room last spring." Marcus's hand settled on her shoulder. They didn't weep. Time had already taken their tears. The garden took them in with a calm that spoke deeper than grief. Levi still stood a few feet off, his hat in his hands. Carol raised her eyes. "Chaplain Holt." His name broke gentle. "Mrs. Reyes." He came to her, not bothering with a composure he didn't own. "Your son was the finest man I served with. I think about him most days." Carol rose and folded both of her hands around his. Beyond the garden, voices thinned and footsteps slowed, the lull widening. "He wrote us about you," she said. "Every week, the chaplain who kept losing to him at cards and claimed it was ministry." Her laugh broke halfway. "He said you asked about my garden by name. The Mr. Lincoln roses." Marcus stood and put out his hand. When Levi took it, he covered the grip with his other palm and held on past any handshake. "Danny said you were the one who kept the young ones upright," he said. "Never told us who kept you upright." He searched Levi's face. "Somebody doing that." Levi's answer went sideways toward the edge of the garden where Annie stood watching, without pretending otherwise. Marcus followed the glance. He released Levi's hand with a single nod. Business concluded. Levi turned back to Carol. "Are the roses blooming?" "They are." Her grip locked firm. "They always bloom for the 4th. The flower at Carol's shoulder gave off its perfume, a fresh honey scent, when the breeze stirred. Her son's roses had come with her. At the gate, a shadow fell across Annie's arm. Mayor Dalton, breathless, tapping his watch. "The sound tech," he mouthed. "He has to leave by 4:30. Taken aback, Annie hesitated. The microphone, the one item she had underlined twice, because a dedication with 200 people and a dead microphone was the kind of failure that followed a chamber director for years. Every professional instinct told her to go. 10 minutes. Levi would never know she'd left. She pressed the clipboard into the mayor's palms. "We'll manage," she mouthed back. His thick eyebrows climbed, though he agreed. The microphone would be untested, a minor check, because whatever happened in the next few minutes, Levi shouldn't raise his eyes and find the gate empty. "Mrs. Reyes, Mr. Reyes." Levi drew a breath that took visible effort. "I have carried a message for your son for 18 months. I tried to put it in a letter 4 times, and I couldn't, because it wasn't mine to fold into an envelope. It was mine to hand to you." Marcus went rigid beside his wife. Carol's hands stayed folded around Levi's, and she nodded, barely a breath of movement. Levi said softly, "I was with Danny at the end. I held his hand." Levi's voice came low. "He asked me whether he was going to see Jesus. I told him yes, and I have never in my life been more certain of an answer. And then he said, 'Tell my parents I wasn't afraid.'" He allowed the words to stand in the garden air, under the maple, beside the bench with their boy's name on it. Those were his last words. He spent them on you. From the gate, Annie pressed her knuckles to her lips. All these weeks, she'd watched him shoulder his pack alone, whatever it held, never letting a soul help him with the straps. In the space of a single moment, he'd set it down. With no tasks to hide behind and a disrupted schedule, she braced herself. She'd stopped counting the line of Levi's broad shoulders weeks ago. What held her now was the courage to stand before a grieving mother and speak about a son's last gift. A woman could build a life beside a man like that. Carol stood taller, her eyes glistening. Marcus gripped Levi's shoulder. 18 months, he said. So you could say it to our faces. Your son didn't say it to an envelope. I couldn't either, Levi replied. He wasn't afraid. Carol said it to the bench, to the maple, to the garden. Danny got to say it, and you got it here. She turned back to Levi. His letter said you were the one worth listening to over there. His father and I read them aloud at supper. Feels like we've known you for years. Thank you for coming, Levi said. We wouldn't have missed it for the world. Carol touched the rose at her shoulder. Danny loved the fourth best of any holiday. He'd drag a blanket to the yard and wait 2 hours for the first shell to go up. Her voice gained firmer ground. We'll watch them for him tonight. Levi tipped his head back. His gaze climbed the young maple, its slim trunk rising into a crown where the light sifted through thin leaves. More and more, beauty kept catching him off guard, arriving uninvited, refusing to apologize for it. Danny would have appreciated this tree, he murmured. He liked anything with a future. Before Annie led them toward the seats, Carol spoke of the girl Danny had planned to marry, wed now to a kind man back home in Sacramento, and how Danny would have celebrated that for her. He never could stand to see anybody lonely, Carol said. Levi smiled, because those were true words. He glanced past the maple to where Annie waited at the garden gate. Carol Reyes followed his glance and smiled, too. Chapter 15. Every few seconds, Annie's gaze darted to the microphone waiting beside the memorial bench. She hadn't tested it. She'd traded the sound check for an hour at the garden gate with Levi. She wouldn't reclaim that hour even if someone offered. Not for anything. Still, her stomach gave a small pull every time she surveyed the silent black stand. Mayor Dalton, at the far end of the row, sent up a questioning eyebrow. Annie gave a thin shrug. Too late now. The chairs were nearly full by 4:45. Folks streamed in through the garden gate, kids trailing behind with half-frozen ice pops, the families who always claim the shade, talking about the county's new culvert. Annie scanned the rows again. Every chair was spoken for, and latecomers were spreading out, claiming patches of grass beyond the roses. 200 people, maybe more. The garden had traded its earlier calm for conversation, low laughter, and the rustle of summer dresses slipping along the narrow paths. The roses gave up their perfume in waves, pieces pale yellow edged pink, double delights ivory rimmed in dark red, both blooming at once. Beneath the sweetness ran the green smell of mulch, damp from the day's watering. When Mayor Dalton stood and introduced Carol Reyes a short time later, she stepped forward alone. Marcus remained seated in the front row, his hat pressed to his knee. The gold star pin on his shirt pocket said what he couldn't. He told me he could bury our son twice, or speak of him once, but not both, Carol had told Annie earlier, nodding toward her husband. The crimson Mr. Lincoln rose, rested over Carol's heart, its outer petals softening beneath the July heat. Beside it gleamed the small gold star pin Carol wore. The rose would fade by evening, while the star never would. A bee worked the rose nearest the podium, unbothered by the crowd, and Annie fixed on it hard. If she watched Carol for too long, she would cry. Carol smiled at the crowd and reached for the microphone. One tap. Silence. She tapped again. Nothing. Not even a hiss. A single second hung heavy, and Annie's pulse lurched. No. No, no, no. Hundreds of people, and gold star parents, the dedication everyone had worked toward for endless weeks, and a dead microphone. She stepped forward on instinct, and Mayor Dalton matched her. Exactly what we feared, he whispered, voicing her frustration. Carol laid a hand on the stand and shook her head. Well, she said with a flick of humor, Danny always claimed machines behaved better once he walked away. Laughter scattered in pockets, rolling forward until the knot in Annie's chest dropped low. She and the mayor stepped back to their seats. Carol edged the microphone aside. I raised a farm boy. She folded her hands in front of her. I promise you, I can still talk louder than this thing. More laughter. Once it faded, every face leaned forward. My son wrote us once a week. Carol's voice rose with surprising strength. Not long letters, and often only a page or two, sometimes less. Her smile wavered. His handwriting wasn't any prettier in his 20s than when he was 10. A few muted chuckles answered her. But every letter had people in it. Her head dipped toward the bench. The men he served beside. The medic who never slept. The sergeant with a knack for breaking tension. And one man appeared in almost every single letter. Her eyes lifted and went straight to Levi. My Danny called him chaplain. Not because it was his title, but because that's who he was. Her voice softened. Danny wrote that Chaplain Holt never hurried past a hurting soldier. He remembered everyone's family and prayed when words ran out, and somehow he always knew who cheated at cards. Smiles spread. Annie followed suit. Carol drew a slow breath. Bitterroot has loved my son well. You've honored him. But there's one voice I hoped you'd hear today. She turned toward Levi. Chaplain Holt. Levi had known this call would come. He had agreed to it, prepared for it, prayed over it. Knowing did not lighten it. His fingers closed on the brim of his hat, all those seasons gathering into a single instant, and he understood that a man could say yes in an office at night and still have to say it again in front of 200 people and a mother's waiting eyes. Carol's gaze held. Chaplain, will you say a few words over our son's bench? Before Levi could answer, the student teacher lifted his flute and the first notes of Amazing Grace floated into the evening. When the final note fell silent, Levi stepped forward, passing the silent microphone without a glance. Men who had prayed beneath open skies never depended on electricity, he said, pressing his hand to the cool brass plaque. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Danny brought those words into places no parent should ever have to imagine. He also lived them. He wasn't fearless. None of us are. But he chose courage anyway. There's a difference. Levi steadied his stance. People sometimes thank soldiers for giving their lives, and I understand why. But if you really want to honor them, live the freedom they protected. He angled toward Carol and Marcus. Danny once asked me a question, whether God ever got tired of people asking the same questions over and over. I told him no. His voice dragged rough in his throat. The truth is that I've asked God many of those same questions myself. His gaze picked out Annie from the crowd. She'd promised him the front row and ended up standing with the mayor instead, one eye on the dead microphone, and she suspected Levi understood exactly why. Levi continued speaking. In the middle of it, God answered. Levi held Annie's gaze for only a single breath, then glanced toward Walt, standing near the back. That man reminded me that a fellow doesn't have to speak every hurt before he can start healing. Walt gave a wave. That's right, son. Levi then said, and then there's the Chamber of Commerce director, Levi continued. She kept showing up with another reason to stay, another invitation, an excuse to be part of this town again. I assumed she was trying to save Bitterroot's celebration. I finally realized she was helping to save me. Annie's chest locked, and every person in the garden disappeared. There was only Levi standing beneath the maple tree. And that's all I've got, Levi said. If Danny were standing here, he'd probably tell me I've talked over long enough, and then he'd ask whether anybody brought apple pie. Levi grinned and rested both hands on the memorial bench. If he taught me anything, it's that gratitude shouldn't stay trapped inside us. If there's someone you love, tell them. If there's someone you need to forgive, don't wait another year. If you've forgotten to thank God for unremarkable days, his gaze strayed to the mountains, radiant beneath the lowering sun. Start tonight. He bowed his head, and the crowd followed. Father, thank you for a soldier who loved you with a plain-spoken faith. Thank you for parents who raised him well. Thank you for friends who are here to honor him. And thank you for never walking away from us, even when we wander. Amen rose from every corner as Levi lifted his head. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Walt began to clap. One pair of hands, another joined, then another. Levi tipped his hat toward Carol and Marcus before stepping back, and Annie met him halfway. She slipped her fingers around his forearm. You okay? She whispered. He cast his gaze toward Danny's bench. I will be. She smiled. So will they. Carol grabbed Annie's hand as she passed. Thank you. This was Danny's day, Annie replied. It was. Carol squeezed Annie's fingers, then pulled her into a quick embrace. But you gave it back to us. The gathering at the bench loosened by degrees, the town giving Carol and Marcus room, then company, then casseroles pressed on them to put in their rental car for the drive to the motel later. By the time boots scuffed across the gravel, the afternoon had spent itself, and the sun had slipped where enough to paint the land bronze. The day's last ceremony waited, the one Bitterroot saved for dusk. The flag retirement. Toddlers chased one another through the grass with glow necklaces around their wrists, while volunteers gathered American flags from the wooden crates beside the fellowship hall, each one collected over the year from porches and businesses around the valley, too faded or torn to fly another season and too honored to discard. Levi conversed with the 3 veterans who had marched in the parade. Grandpa Henry Whitlock's index card rested in Levi's shirt pocket. When the first flag was unfolded, the fabric revealed frayed corners, sun-faded stripes, and a tear mended long ago. Levi accepted it with both hands. Annie waited beside the mare. Her grandfather had performed the ceremony every 4th of July since she was little. He moved slowly because some rituals deserved an unhurried touch. As Levi completed the final fold, she whispered, I miss you, Grandpa. The townspeople wandered toward the open field, while Stella argued loudly with Reed about the best place to watch the fireworks. Levi reached the church steps when Zane approached. I almost left after the parade. He shoved his hands into his pockets. Figured I'd seen what I came to see. But then I stayed. Zane gave a humorless laugh. Funny what catches up with a man. Levi waited, nudging a loose pebble across the walk. Zane pushed his hat back and squinted. I can't get those years back. No, you can't. Can quit wasting the ones I've got left. He faced Levi. I'm withdrawing the claim. You sure? Sure enough. Zane's mouth flattened. Cal left the ranch to the man who stayed. He shrugged. Truth doesn't ask my permission. Levi held out his hand. If you ever want to see the place, you don't need a lawyer. Zane stared at Levi's hand for a long second, then gripped it. I'll think on it. Some reconciliations began with speeches. Others began with a handshake that should have happened decades earlier. The exchange happened across the churchyard, while Annie stood near enough to witness it. Levi's stride seemed different as he came away from his uncle. Lighter, surer. She grinned and kicked off her sandals, gathering them in one hand. The hillside was a patchwork of quilts and lawn chairs by the time she reached the field. Someone passed paper sacks of kettle corn down a blanket. A pig-tailed little girl insisted on saluting every flag, earning fond smiles from the adults nearby. Everyone peered toward the sky, except her. She was searching for one man, finally spotting Levi standing apart from the crowd near the split rail fence. His hat was low, his hands hooked loosely in his back pockets. She raced through the grass without calling his name. When she reached him, he turned before she spoke, as though he'd sensed her coming. "Annie." Levi tucked a few loose strands from her hair behind her ear. His fingertips stalled long enough to make her pulse falter. "You've been on your feet since sunrise." "So have you." "I wasn't directing a parade." A tired laugh escaped her. "I don't think I've got another parade left in me." "I hope not. I'd hate to compete with one." He drew her into his arms and kissed her. Near the front of the field, Marcus reached over to straighten the wilted rose on Carol's dress. She covered his hand with hers, and whatever he whispered drew a smile that held on. Annie's chest loosened. Danny would have liked seeing them smile tonight. The first shell streaked skyward, carving a silver line before breaking open above the valley. Levi's gaze snapped toward the ridge. Annie slipped her fingers through his before he could step away. The second burst scattered gold. His thumb stopped moving. She threaded her fingers more firmly in his grasp. "I'm here," she whispered. "You've been here all summer." He brought her hand up and pressed his mouth to her knuckles. Another firework climbed the sky, streaks of green and silver. "I used to count," he murmured. She shifted to watch his face instead of the fireworks. "What?" "The seconds between explosions. If I knew where they were coming from, it helped." His gaze stayed low on the horizon. "Old habits." "You don't have to explain." "I wanted to." He rubbed slow circles into the back of her hand. "For a long time, I supposed if anyone saw the parts of me that came home from overseas, they'd decide I wasn't the man they remembered. I never wanted that man. I want the man standing in front of me." "I wasn't sure there was enough left." Tears shimmered. "Oh, Levi." She brushed a speck of ash that wasn't there. "You were always enough." His eyes closed, and he leaned into her. The gesture nearly broke her heart. "You know what I prayed?" he asked. She shook her head. "I asked God why he brought me home. Not alive, but home. I couldn't figure out what I was supposed to do with a life I'd stopped expecting to have." Her fingers slipped around the front of his shirt. "You were supposed to come home." He tried to smile. It didn't hold. "Maybe." "You were supposed to come back to you." The sky bloomed with another wave of color, bright enough to turn the pasture yellow for an instant. Levi never took his attention from her. "I love you, Annie Whitlock." "I've loved you longer." A tear slipped free. He brushed it away before it reached her smile. "You're a stubborn, impossible cowboy. You know that." "So I've been told." He squinted in the direction of his ranch. "I want Sunday mornings with you. Coffee before daylight, calving season. Mud on our boots." His hands framed her face. "Branding season. Snow piling on the porch. Every ordinary Tuesday the Lord sees fit to give us." "I've been waiting to hear that since high school." "I'm sorry." "Don't be." A low laugh escaped her. "You were worth waiting for." He kissed her as he'd stood through every hard season, with both feet planted. When he drew her close, he wasn't saying goodbye. Around them, the crowd applauded. "One more thing," he said. "There's more?" He took both of her hands. "I'd like to court you properly." Her eyebrows lifted. "Properly?" "Dinners." She smiled. "Horseback rides." She nodded. "Church suppers." Her smile widened. "I'll even learn to dance if that's what it takes." She laughed outright. "Oh, I definitely want to see that." "Is that a yes?" She slid her arms around his waist. "It's been yes for a very long time." The final fireworks exploded overhead, turning the night red, white, and blue. Levi bowed his head. "Thank you, God," he whispered. Annie nestled into his chest as the last sparks floated into darkness. The valley held its peace, and so, at last, did he. Epilogue. The letter from the State Commission arrived 6 weeks later, and Annie read it twice at her desk before she trusted herself to believe it. Bitterroot had won the Spotlight grant outright, full restoration funding for the Grange Hall. The committee's notes citing, among other things, an unusually high degree of authentic community participation and a flag retirement ceremony of, in the Commission's own careful language, exceptional historical and emotional significance. Annie phoned Levi before anyone else. He drove into town within the half hour, lifted her clean off her feet in the middle of the chamber office before they remembered to be embarrassed about it. Zane Holt's lawyer sent a brief letter that same month, formally withdrawing the claim, no further correspondence required. Levi wrote back anyway, by hand, inviting his uncle to Thanksgiving if he ever passed through Montana again. Zane wrote back to say he might take him up on it, and asked, almost shyly, whether Cal had kept any photographs from when they were boys. Construction on the Grange Hall began in September, scaffolding climbing the old brick facade, while half the town paused to watch the work one afternoon or another, as people do when they've waited years to see a project finally happen. Grace and Cole brought their little girl to watch the scaffolding go up one afternoon, and Cole allowed that the old hall might outlast all of them if the masons did their job. Annie kept her grandfather's letters framed on her office wall beside the photograph of him in dress uniform, and told the contractor more than once she wanted the original stage floor preserved if it could possibly be managed. The following spring, Levi led the flag retirement at the Memorial Day ceremony. No one had to ask him this time. When he stepped forward, 3 veterans moved into place beside him without a word. It had become what they did. Most Sundays, he and Annie slipped into Pastor Michael's early service before the rest of the town arrived. They sat near the front now, where sunlight poured through the stained glass windows and painted ribbons of color across the pews. Levi bowed his head before every hymn, offering a prayer of thanks for the God who had never stopped pursuing him, even when he'd walked away. Wednesday evenings belonged to the veterans. The fellowship hall smelled of coffee and old pine, and the metal chairs scraped across the floor as the men settled into their circle. Some talked right away. Others needed time. Levi waited. "Anybody want to share what's on their mind tonight?" Silence held until Earl shifted in his chair. "My granddaughter graduated from kindergarten yesterday." A few smiles appeared around the circle. "I almost didn't go." Earl rubbed his palms together. "Too many people, too much noise." "But you went," Levi confirmed. "I did." Earl looked across the room at him. "You kept saving me a chair." Levi smiled. "I figured someday you'd sit in it." Earl gave a slow nod. "Guess yesterday was the first time I stopped looking for the nearest exit." Levi reached for the Bible resting on the table beside him. The pages opened easily to a verse he'd carried in his heart. "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go." His voice caught for only a heartbeat. The men waited. Finally, Walt leaned back with a grin. "Well," he said, "if Earl made it through a kindergarten graduation, I reckon there's hope for the rest of us." Chuckles circled the room. One of the men reached for the coffee pot. Another veteran asked Earl if his granddaughter had spotted him in the audience. Before long, the conversation flowed as easily as the coffee. Levi surveyed the circle. Months earlier, he had come looking for a place to survive. Now, by God's grace, he had found a place to help others live. Carol Reyes wrote twice. Once, to thank them for the photographs Annie had sent from the dedication, where the rose-cutting Carol had mailed stood newly planted beside Danny's bench, a Mr. Lincoln taking hold in Montana soil, and once simply to say she and her husband hoped to visit again soon. Marcus added a single line at the bottom in his own hand. "Still standing, son. Hope the same for you." On a clear evening in October, a year later, the ranch gone gold around them. Levi walked Annie out, past the paddock fence where Stella had once counted his horses wrong, twice in a row, and mentioned a dragon in his barn. It was one of those borrowed days Montana grants before winter calls in its debts, and the last of it stayed in the air, wood smoke from the Hutchins place, fallen apples fermenting under the tree by the barn, pine drifting down off the ridgeline whenever the breeze turned. Above, the sky had begun its slow work, deepening to rose, the first star waiting its turn. Frost would come by morning. Neither minded the chill on its way. Levi had come straight from the church board meeting, still in his good white shirt, sleeves buttoned at the wrist, though he'd left the collar open, and his uncle's hat rode back on his head at an angle Cal himself used to wear at the end of a satisfied day. Annie had put on the red sundress under her wool cardigan, the one she'd worn the day of the Founders' celebration, the day everything between them stopped pretending to be professional. She'd reached past newer dresses to find it, and if Levi noticed, and she suspected he noticed everything, he had the grace not to mention that she'd chosen it on purpose. Her braid had loosened over one shoulder in the wind, gold strands escaping, and she'd given up chasing them the same as she'd given up covering her freckles, because Levi had confessed on an August evening that he loved every one of them, and she had decided to believe him. He stopped her at the fence rail with a touch to her sleeve. When she turned, his expression undid her a little, the openness of it. This man who had come home rationed and guarded, allowing her to read every line of his face without charging admission. He met her eyes. "Will you build the rest of your life with me? Right here, on this ranch. With me?" "Yes." The answer burst out before he'd finished. She covered her mouth with both hands, her shoulders quivering, and laughed through tears. She reached for him. "Yes," she whispered again. He slipped the ring onto her finger, his own hands still unsteady. Then he gathered her close and kissed her as the mountains deepened from blue to violet and his hat tumbled in the grass, forgotten. He'd come home expecting nothing, and home had given him back all of it. The land, the town, the God who had been listening the whole time, and the woman laughing against his chest with the creek air cold on their faces and the entire gold evening holding still around them. Behind them, the donkey, who thought he was a horse, let out a single indignant bray, as if he too had an opinion on the matter and intended to be heard. The end. Recipe from Mabel's Diner, sign from above. Cherry pie. In Faith and Fireworks, Mabel Sawyer insists her cherry pie is basically a sign from above. Here it is, as she would serve it in Bitterroot, one slice at a time, with strong coffee and a side of good advice. Makes one 9-inch pie. Ingredients: 2 pie crusts, homemade or prepared. 5 cups pitted tart cherries, fresh or frozen and thawed. 1 cup granulated sugar. 1/4 cup cornstarch. 1 tablespoon fresh lemon juice, 1/2 teaspoon almond extract, 1 tablespoon butter, cut into small pieces, 1 egg, beaten, coarse sugar for the top. Directions. Heat the oven to 425 degrees, fit 1 crust into a 9-inch pie plate, and chill it while you make the filling. In a large bowl, stir the cherries, sugar, cornstarch, lemon juice, and almond extract until no dry cornstarch remains. Let the filling rest 10 minutes so the juices wake up. Pour the filling into the chilled crust and dot with butter. Top with the second crust, either whole with slits cut for steam or woven into a lattice the town can admire. Crimp the edges, brush with the beaten egg, and sprinkle with coarse sugar. Bake 20 minutes, then lower the oven to 375 degrees and bake 35 to 40 minutes more until the crust turns deep gold and the filling bubbles thick at the vents. Shield the edges with foil if they brown too fast. Cool at least 3 hours before slicing. Mabel says patience is the secret ingredient, and she has never once been wrong. A note to my listeners. Thank you for listening to Faith and Fireworks, and for spending time in Bitterroot, Montana, with me. What happens when a man who has spent his life praying for others wonders if God still hears him? Levi Holt carried that question home, and Annie Whitlock turned out to be exactly the person God placed in his path. Alongside the celebrations and the fireworks, this story honors those who served. If you have lost a loved one who wore the uniform, I wrote those scenes with you in my heart. Above all, this is a story about coming home. Home to a town, home to love, and home to a faith that never stopped waiting. I believe God listens. I believe He sees the real you. If you enjoyed Levi and Annie's story, please leave a review. Your kind words help other listeners find Bitterroot. Until next time, may your days be filled with faith, hope, and a sky full of light. This has been Faith and Fireworks, a sweet and inspirational cowboy romance written and narrated by Josie Riviera. Copyright 2026 by Josie Riviera. All rights reserved. I'd love to stay connected. You can find me at josieriviera.com. Until next time, happy listening.